Hi there, and welcome to this tutorial on ASP.NET Zero, building single-page applications with ASP.NET Core and Angular. My name is Jill Clearen, and I will teach you how you can use ASP.NET Zero to learn how to build your first fully working application using the product. In this tutorial, we will be using the ASP.NET Core and Angular version of ASP.NET Zero to build an application. And so as said, by the end of this tutorial, you will have gained the skills to build a fully working application with ASP.NET Zero. That knowledge can then be used to build your own applications based on the product. I've split up this course in a number of modules to make it easier for you to follow along. Just like a book contains some chapters, this tutorial is split up in 4 modules to be precise. This also makes it possible for you to skip to the section that you're most interested in. In this first module, we are going to start things by exploring what this course will bring for you. Each module of this course will start with a brief overview of what you're going to learn in the module at hand. As mentioned, this first module will be an introduction module where I'm going to give you the necessary information to follow along with the rest of the course. I'm going to start this module by a short introduction that I've named Hello ASP.NET Zero. If you don't know what ASP.NET Zero is or what you can do with it, this short introduction will definitely help you in understanding the product. After that, we are going to see in a bit more detail what the goals of this course are for you. Setting the expectations right at the very beginning always helps, I think. We'll be building an application in this course, and I want to show you at this stage already the finished application. You'll be able to follow along with everything I'm doing, so you too will have a working application by the end of this tutorial. Of course, you'll also need to have all the correct tools installed, and that's what we will be doing next. In the final part of this module, we are going to get our hands dirty with the product and build and explore a first application in a part that I've named Getting Up and Running with ASP.NET Zero. So, as mentioned, let's make sure we all have the foundations right and start with a hello to ASP.NET Zero. If we need to describe ASP.NET Zero in a single sentence, the following would cover it. ASP.NET Zero is a starting point for new web applications with a modern UI and a solid architecture. It's the first code that you see when you go to the ASP.NET Zero website. And yes, I have shamelessly copied it here, since it really wraps nicely what the product is all about. Using ASP.NET Zero, we can start from a base solution from which you have the source code and can thus make all the changes you want. It features a modern UI built with the latest technologies, and underneath the covers, it's built on proven patterns and practices. So, why would you choose for using ASP.NET Zero? As mentioned, it will give you a head start on your application development. Let me put it this way. When you as a developer are asked to start working on a new project, we all start thinking about all the things we need to do before one line of business code will actually be written. We need to think of technologies we're going to use. We need to set up the architecture. We need to make sure that everything is secure, and so we'll invest time in authentication and authorization. We'll need to bring in logging, exception handling, and so much more. I'm sure you can recognize this problem. I've faced it myself many times in the past. It's a costly situation for sure. ASP.NET Zero brings all of that already in the box. The questions I've just outlined and many others are already answered for you. We don't need to reinvent the wheel with every new project we start. A lot of projects can run on the same foundation. It even brings added value in that the team members will recognize the same patterns being used across projects, thus making them more productive. They don't have to investigate how everything works. No, instead, they know the foundation of the project and can get started straight away. ASP.NET Zero is an opinionated framework, and quite some features have already been decided for you. However, it uses the latest and most commonly used frameworks. That is, of course, a good thing. ASP.NET Zero is built like a foundation, just like your next project should be built. When you start a new project, there are so many things to think of. Even if you think of all of them, the way that you implement the architecture might not be ideal. ASP.NET Zero is based on solid principles. The solution you'll get, and that you'll be building your application on top of, is based on a lot of experience and best practices building large and complex applications. The structure of the solution is layered and modular and uses dependency injection across the board. For your domain logic, it also can use DDD, so domain-driven design principles. This means that it's feasible to handle complex domains with what you get out of the box with ASP.NET Zero. As I already said, ASP.NET Zero uses the latest technologies, both on the server and the client side of the application. It's always a challenge when starting a new project to decide on technologies to be used. Well, when you decide on using ASP.NET Zero, that choice has already been made for you. You may be thinking, hey, I have less freedom to choose what I want. Well, in many cases, that actually is a good thing. It's a hard job sometimes to find all the bits and pieces that work nicely together. And rest assured, they use the latest versions. The selected frameworks also aren't any obscure ones, which aren't commonly used. No, instead, they are using the most commonly used ones. Related to that, ASP.NET Zero doesn't just contain a single solution, it contains multiple ones. I'll show you the different technology options you get very soon, but expect .NET Core, Angular, jQuery, ASP.NET MVC and Xamarin options amongst others. Typically, one of the biggest challenges when building a new application is the security aspect. Making sure that the site is working securely, that only authenticated users can access information they are authorized to see, and so on, those are typically underestimated. In an era of data leakages and security issues all over the place, it's something that you have to get right the first time. It's terrible for your business to be in the news as the next company which got its security wrong. ASP.NET Zero will handle a large portion of this as well. Its built-in security system is based on the proven ASP.NET Identity Framework, part of ASP.NET Core. This industry-standard framework is built with best practices in mind and is used by millions of applications. It also integrates with Identity Server 4, another standard in the industry in the security area. ASP.NET Zero comes with some of the typical security-related pages we need to build for just any application, including login, registration, and so on. All login attempts will also be logged automatically, and users can be logged out. Other important security features are also enabled, including third-party authentication and two-factor authentication. Another core feature that is baked into ASP.NET Zero that we haven't discussed yet is multi-tenancy. While it's not required to be used, an ASP.NET Zero application can be used to serve multiple customers with a single solution. To support this, it includes customization options per tenant, subscription management, PayPal integration for payments, and much more. We'll see this briefly later in this course. It is not the purpose of this course to be an advertisement for ASP.NET Zero, and so therefore I'm not going to go through all of the features in more detail. There are, however, many more great features included in the box. ASP.NET Zero can easily be localized. Support for that is baked into the framework. It also comes with an easy way to manage settings within the application, and this also works nicely combined with the multi-tenancy aspect. The creators also make sure that the repeating tasks that we often as developers have to do are handled in a dry way. Let me explain. Think of how many lines of code you have written to handle exceptions, to manage logging, perform validation, and so on. These are so-called cross-cutting concerns. They need to be done throughout the application. ASP.NET Zero comes with support to perform all of these tasks easily without repeating ourselves. Another thing that we often spend time on is testing. Testing is hugely important. I probably don't have to explain that to you. The architecture that is included in ASP.NET Zero lends itself to easy testing. There are unit tests included based on XUnit. Also, Signal R is supported in the framework. This can be used for real-time push notification support within the application. And yes, like I mentioned, this is just a brief list of the features I find really important. There are definitely some more, but let's not waste too much time here. Although the creators of ASP.NET Zero have already made a lot of choices already, they understand that your company may be enforcing certain technology choices for your development work. For that reason, they don't offer ASP.NET Zero in just one single version. No, instead, you get the choice between different versions based on the different technology combinations. Let's say that the flagship version is based on ASP.NET Core and Angular. At the time of the creation of this tutorial, the latest version is ASP.NET Core 2.2 and Angular 6. To be clear, this version is a single-page version containing APIs and a lot of client-side functionality written in Angular. This version is also the one that we will be using in this course. Next, another version combines ASP.NET Core MVC with jQuery, so basically there's less client-side functionality in this case. Another option is based on slightly older technologies. It uses ASP.NET MVC, so not the core version, with AngularJS. Finally, there's also a completely different type of application based on Xamarin. This of course targets mobile applications that run natively on Android and iOS devices. Now that you have a good understanding of ASP.NET Zero, I want to take a short moment to explain what my goals for you are with this tutorial. It's always a good idea to make sure that we are on the same page here so that you know where you'll be after spending time on this video. While we will be mostly looking at the technical side of things and I'll be spending time to build an application together with you, one of the goals for this course is definitely helping you in deciding if ASP.NET Zero is something for you. Of course, by seeing how we can build an application with it will help with that. We've already talked about the fact that starting a new project today can be a somewhat cumbersome task. There are really so many things to think of. Which patterns do I use? Should we be using DDD? Or even, how do I start using DDD in my project? Which frameworks for the server and the client side do I use? If you are looking at a foundation for your next project, ASP.NET Zero can really help you with that. It gives you a tested foundation built with modern frameworks. One of the things I know might scare developers. Are we stuck when using this framework? I don't want to tie myself into using this or that framework, I can hear you say. I agree. A framework can sometimes be just a bit constraining and it removes some of the freedom developers love. In the case of ASP.NET Zero, it is just a solution that you start from and that you build your application on. It's open for change if there is something in there that you don't like. Feel free to remove it or change it with whatever you want. And it's not a one-man show either. If you have feedback or suggestions, like many other users from around the world, you can suggest a change as well. So with this tutorial, I want to teach you how you can create applications based on ASP.NET Zero. While up until now, you haven't looked at any code, that will soon change. The target audience for this course is therefore clearly developers. By the end of this tutorial, you as a developer will have a clear understanding of what ASP.NET Zero can mean for you. You'll understand what is in the box and also, maybe even more important, what is not included. We'll explore together the architecture used by ASP.NET Zero. This will help you in seeing how you can build applications with it. And the latter is what we'll be spending most of our time with actually, building an application using ASP.NET Zero. We'll also spend some time looking at the tooling that is now available from ASP.NET Zero as well. Finally, I want you to walk away with some next steps that can take you further in your exploration of ASP.NET Zero. Oh, and one more thing. I just said that this course is aimed at developers. To be able to get the maximum from this tutorial, you'll need to have some C# and .NET knowledge. That's of course for the server side. For the client side, we will be using some Angular code. You don't need to be an expert in any of these technologies though. Just basic knowledge will do for what we are going to cover in this tutorial. Alright, time for a first demo. In this demo, we will take a look at the finished application that we will be creating in this course. This will definitely whet your appetite to continue learning with this tutorial. So we'll start this course by taking a look at the finished application that we will be building together throughout this course. We are here on the landing page where I can now log in to my application. I'll log in with admin, that's the username, and the password that I have changed myself already before. I can indicate that the application needs to remember me. I can do a forgot password, but let's not spend time on that right now. So I'll log in here. And then we arrive on this dashboard page. That is, let's say, a placeholder page. I'll talk about it later on. The application that we are building is this phonebook extension here. On this page, we see a number of person instances. So you see my address there, as well as a couple of default person instances that have been added already. In this page, I can search. For example, I can search for myself. And then when I hit enter, it will filter down the list to only the matching people. I can also edit a person over here. And I get this dialog that allows me to change the values for this person. I can also click on the plus here, and that will expand so that I can now enter one or more phone numbers. I can select the type, it's going to be mobile here. I can enter a phone number, and then this phone number is saved to that person. I can also delete it again. I can also, via this button here at the top, add a completely new person. So let me add someone else. And now you see that the dialog allows me to save because I've entered all the required fields. Another person is added to our list. So that is what we will be building together in this course. It's already a nicely working application. Let's head back to the slides. Now that you have seen the finished application, I hope you're eager to get started building an application with ASP.NET Zero. Of course, before we can get started, it's important to make sure that you have the correct tools installed. Let's see what you need to complete this course. In this course, we will be using the Windows stack to build the application. That means that I'll be using Visual Studio for the C# backend stuff. If you don't have a paid license, no fear, as you can easily use Visual Studio Community Edition, which is freely available. Please note that a license restriction applies, for which you can find more information on the Microsoft website. Next, I'll use Visual Studio Code for the Angular part, although you could also use the regular version of Visual Studio for that. Since we will be using NPM, the Node Package Manager, you'll need to have Node installed on your machine as well. TypeScript needs to be installed as well. That can be done through npm. Finally, you'll be needing Yarn as well. Yarn is another package manager, and we will be using it during the development of the application as well. Although I'm using the Windows stack here, I hope you understand that you could easily use an approach completely based on the Mac stack as well. All tools that we are using here have a Mac equivalent, so to build applications with ASP.NET Zero, you can just as easy use your Mac. In the next demo, let me show you the steps to ensure that your development environment is all set up before continuing. So, what do you need to have installed on your machine to get started working on your first ASP.NET Zero application? Well, I recommend that you use Visual Studio. At the time of the recording of this course, Visual Studio 2017 is the latest edition. So you can go to visualstudio.microsoft.com. Actually, you can also go to visualstudio.com and it will redirect you here. Over here, you can actually download a version for Windows. If you don't have a license, you will be able to use the Community Edition, which is the free edition. Do note that some license restrictions apply here. If you have another edition, the Professional and the Enterprise editions, they will of course also work fine. If you want to work with the Mac, well, that's also perfectly fine. You can also use Visual Studio for Mac to build ASP.NET Zero applications. I do recommend for the client-side code, so the Angular code that we will be writing, to use Visual Studio Code. You could also use the plain version of Visual Studio, but I find code a little bit more flexible for the Angular code. So if you want to install it, go to code.visualstudio.com and there you can download a version for Windows. Again, there is also a version for Mac, even for Linux, if you're not running on Windows. Next, you will also need to have Node installed. Go to nodejs.org and there you will be able to download a version for your operating system. We will need this because we are going to use npm, which is the Node package manager, which comes as part of the Node installation. I have this LTS version that you see highlighted here on the screen installed on my machine. You could also use the current version, but it's not really necessary to use a newer version. This LTS, this long-term support version that is, will do fine. Now, once you have Node installed, you can actually install TypeScript. Now, you don't need to download TypeScript yourself. npm will install it for you. What you can do is, once you have Node installed, go to a command prompt and in there type npm install -g, that is global, and then TypeScript. This will install the latest version of TypeScript on your machine. On my machine, it was already installed. Note that I could do this wherever I want it. I'm doing it here in my users folder. That is because npm typically gets added to the pod upon installation. If you want to test that TypeScript has also been installed globally, type tsc, that is the TypeScript compiler, and if you see some output, that actually means that that command has been recognized and you're good to go. Finally, we'll also be using Yarn, the Yarn package manager. Go to yarnpkg.com and download the latest version via this button over here. With these tools installed, you're ready to get started building your first application with ASP.NET Zero. For the sake of completeness, here's the list of tools that we are using together with a link where to get them from. It's finally happening. I think you are ready to get started with ASP.NET Zero. In the last part of this module, we will start with a small application that we will be generating. Okay, let's do this. To continue, I'm going to expect that you have already purchased ASP.NET Zero and you can download the framework from the website. To download, head over to the Downloads section on ASP.NET0.com and there you'll be able to download your copy. Please note that we are using the ASP.NET Core and Angular version here. If you want to download a demo version that doesn't count towards your quota, ensure that you name the project acme.myportal. Once downloaded, your solution will contain a couple of root folders as you can see in the screenshot on the right. Quite logically, in the Angular folder, you'll find the Angular application that you can use in combination with the Angular CLI or Visual Studio Code. I'll be using Visual Studio Code to work with the Angular application. Next, the ASP.NET Core folder contains the ASP.NET Core code. In the version of ASP.NET Zero that we have downloaded here, this will contain an API that is exposed towards the Angular app. We will in this tutorial use Visual Studio to work with this project. If you want, you can also use both as a single solution. Time to get our hands dirty. In this demo, I'll show you how to download your copy of ASP.NET Zero. So let's see how we can download a version of ASP.NET Zero. And let me be clear, you cannot download ASP.NET Zero unless you have a paid-for account. That is a prerequisite. So I do have a paid account, so I can go to this login button here at the top right. And then I log in with my account. And now I can go to this download page. And over here I can create a new application. As you can see, I have already reached the maximum download limit for my account. I basically paid for one download, including my official company name. That's the version that I ran at the beginning of this course, by the way. Now, are we then stuck? Well, actually, no. We can create demo projects, and then basically everything will get created, including the word demo. So it means that you can create an unlimited amount of demo projects, and that's also what we will be doing in this course. But if you build your real application, then you have to use your real project name. I'm going to already create the application that we will be using throughout this course. And so in the project name, I'm going to call it acme.phonebook. And notice the capitalization used in this name here. Next, I can select the version of project I want to generate. I can select between an MVC5 jQuery, MVC5 Angular 1, .NET Core MVC and jQuery, and .NET Core and Angular. The latter is the one that we will be using in this course. Next, I can also select which version of the project I want to build my application upon. In this dropdown, you can see all the versions that were released in the past of AspNet Zero. I think it's a good idea to get started with the latest version. We can also select if you want to use .NET Core or the full .NET framework for this project. Again, we'll use .NET Core. Finally, I can now click on Generate Demo Project. As you can see, don't click on Generate here because that will count towards your regular download limit. I'm going to click here on Generate Demo Project, and then it will, as mentioned, append the word demo to my project name and to other files as well. I need to confirm that I want to create a demo project. Hit OK, and now I will need to wait a couple of seconds and then my download will start. And here is the zip file that contains all the files for my demo project. I will take a look at these in the next demo. Let's return to the slides for a minute here. Now that you have everything installed on your machine, in the next demo we are going to configure things so that we have a running version of ASP.NET Zero. Alright, the goal of the next demo is showing you how you can get from the zip that we downloaded in the previous demo to a running application. Alright, let's do that. So I suggest at this point that you follow along with everything that I'm doing here. And step one is extracting the zip file. I think that's pretty simple. By the way, notice again that the word demo has been added, indicating that this is a free demo project that doesn't count towards your download limit. This is a demo project that we are using in this course. All right, so everything has been extracted. Let's take a look. In this phonebook demo folder here, we actually have a couple of folders. One is the Angular folder, and that will quite logically contain the Angular code. And then we have the ASPNet Core folder, which again quite logically will contain the server-side ASPNet Core code. Let's start by exploring the ASPNet Core folder. Now, why are there different solutions available here? Well, that actually depends on the project type that you are using. We are using the Angular ASP.NET Core combination, so in that case, the web solution will do fine. I will talk more about these solutions and the projects that they contain in the next chapter. So let's start by opening the web solution in Visual Studio. Let's collapse everything here. And under Source, we'll see a couple of projects, including the web host. Make sure that web host has been set as the startup project. The web host is really the API that the Angular application will be talking to. So that is basically the executing application, and that also means that we need to specify the connection string here under app settings. If you haven't worked with ASP.NET Core before, note that the appsettings.json file is, as the name implies, a settings file, and it will contain, among others, settings. These settings include, for example, also the connection string. You can see the connection string here at the top, and I'm going to replace it with my connection string. There we go. I am using localDB. The database name that I'll be using is phonebook demo database. That can, of course, be whatever you want it to be. And I will be using a trusted connection. All right, that's step one to get things to work. Now, the next thing I'll need to do is I'll need to run a database migration. I can do that using the Package Manager console. If you don't know where the Package Manager console is, go to View, Other Windows, and there you'll find Package Manager console. I have it here at the bottom of my screen. Make sure that you select the Entity Framework Core project. We'll see in the next chapter that this project contains the context, the database context. So this will need to be specified as the default project. All right, so in here I can now type update database. This will now compile my application and run a database migration. There we go, the migrations have been applied. ASP.NET Zero is a multi-tenant based solution. That means that we can basically host multiple versions of the application on the same code base. Now, for now, I will disable that. We'll come back to that later in this course. So I'll need to search for the multi-tenancy enabled property and set that to false. You can find this property in the phonebook demo const class. And we can now set this property to false. With these steps done, we can now run the server-side ASP.NET Core project. Let's hit the run button and see the result. The result is a Swagger UI demo page where I can test all the API calls that are exposed on my application. If you don't know what Swagger or Swagger UI is, don't fear, we'll talk about that later in this course. So with this API running, we can now take a look at the client-side application. So that is the Angular application. So leave this running for now. So we'll go back to Phonebook demo and we'll now open the Angular project here. As you can see, there is a CSProge file and a solution, but I'll not be using that. I will be using Visual Studio Code, which doesn't really need this because it's based on the folder structure rather than a CSProge file. So I'll copy this path here and I'll go to Visual Studio Code. Now in Visual Studio Code, I can open a folder. I will specify my folder here, the Angular folder, select that one, and it will now open my application. Now you need to go to the terminal, and at this point we now need to restore packages. I showed you earlier in this module that you need to have yarn installed because this is where it will actually be used. So in the terminal window you can go ahead and type yarn. I've done a fast forward here, and as you can see, all my packages have been successfully restored. As mentioned earlier, this should also work with npm, but we get better results with yarn at this point. So I do recommend using yarn for restoring of the packages. So now we can run the application, and for that we'll use npm start. ASP.NET Zero comes with a fully configured CLI so that we can fire all the typical commands. And as mentioned, I will be using npm start here. This will now compile my application and host it via localhost port 4200. I've again fast forwarded things a little bit. I don't think it's very useful that to watch my machine compiling my application. But at the end, it did say compiled successfully. So that means that we can now go to a new browser window and take a look at the result. So here's a fresh, clean browser page. Let's now go to localhost 4200. We've now arrived on the login page. The default username is admin and the default password is 123QWE. So let's enter these. Click on login. I will now come to this reset password page where I can enter my own password. I'm going to enter my new password. There we go, we can submit it. And now we land on that dashboard that we've seen before. So now we have a fully running application. I hope you followed along and you already see the result of your work at this point. With that, we have reached the end of this first module. I'm confident that by now you have a good understanding of what ASP.NET Zero is all about and what are its main features and benefits. Your environment should also now be up and running, and a first project should be running on your machine as well. You've also seen the final application that we will be building throughout this course. With all the administration out of the way, I think it's now time to start exploring ASP.NET Zero in more detail. I hope you will join me on this endeavor. See you in the next part. Hi there, and welcome to the second module of this tutorial on ASP.NET Zero, building single-page applications with ASP.NET Core and Angular. I'm Jill Claren, and I will be your trainer for this module. In the previous module, we have looked at the features of ASP.NET Zero, and we have also created the first application with the framework. In this second module, we are going to dive deeper in ASP.NET Zero. We are going to explore the different building blocks that the framework contains. This way, you will have the necessary knowledge to start building an application in the next module. So, how are we going to tackle this then? Well, let's start by taking a look at the agenda for this module. As you have learned near the end of the previous module, the version of ASP.NET Zero that we are working with is the ASP.NET Core and Angular version. So, basically, we'll have a backend and a frontend to explore. And that's exactly what we are going to do in this very module. First, we are going to take a look at the backend built with ASP.NET Core, and I'm going to show you the relevant parts of the architecture so that you understand how things are built. Next, we will do the same thing, but then with the client-side Angular code. In the final section of this module, I'm also going to show you the ASP.NET Zero Power Tools, a toolset built by the people behind ASP.NET Zero and used to get some scaffolded code directly set up for you. I hope you are ready. Let's do this. So as mentioned, we will be starting with the exploration of the backend, so the ASP.NET Core project in the first section of this module. Let's take a look at the completed solution architecture of ASP.NET Zero. As mentioned, we are working here with the ASP.NET Core API backend and the Angular frontend combination. So the backend consists out of several Visual Studio projects built with ASP.NET Core. Of course, this is the server-side code that will be exposing an API towards the client. Typically, when building a regular ASP.NET Core API, you would create a controller that is exposing an endpoint. While that is definitely the normal way of doing it, ASP.NET Zero is using something called application services, which will be exposed. We'll talk later how this is done, but in essence, these services will be exposing an endpoint for the client to connect with. On the client side, we have an Angular solution. We can host this under the ASP.NET Core application as a client app or deploy it separately. It's in fact nothing more than plain JavaScript and CSS. It's indeed a SPA, a single-page application. We will explore the Angular project in much detail later in this module. For now, just remember that this part is relying on the typical ways an Angular application is built, so based out of components. We have the account module used mainly for authentication-related functionality. This will communicate with the backend to authenticate the user. Once logged in, the user will be redirected to the app module. From now on, all communication with the backend will happen by including a token in the header so that validation of the token can take place on the backend. In ASP.NET Zero, as we'll see in the upcoming demo, there are quite a few projects that you'll get out of the box, and it can be a bit daunting initially to know what does what. When you take a look at the available solution files, so SLN files, you'll see amongst others an all solution that contains, as said, quite a few projects. Not taking into account the name of the generated project, you'll see quite a number of projects which have been generated, as you can see here. And I'm even leaving out the Xamarin related projects. Those are the Android and iOS projects. Let's take a look at the generated projects. The application project is an important one to start with. It will typically contain those application services, so the backend logic. We will be writing code in there to expose functionality to the client. That is, in fact, a .NET Core class library. The application client project is similar and exposes functionality to the client. Under Application Shared, we can find, as the name implies, abstractions for these services, so interfaces as well as DTOs that will be used for the communication with the client. In the application that we will be building, we'll write most of the code in these projects. Next, we have the Core and the Core Shared projects. The Core project will typically contain entities and domain services, so more the domain layer functionality. And under Core Shared, we can find constants, enums, and other helpers. Next, we can see the Entity Framework Core project. As you may have been expecting, this project will contain all code that has to do with the EF Core implementation. EF Core, short for Entity Framework Core, is the .NET Core implementation of Entity Framework, which was available in other .NET, so non-.NET Core implementations. So we'll find in here typically the repository implementations, DB contexts, and the like. Next, and this is definitely an important one, we also have several web projects. Web.MVC, as the name implies, contains a regular MVC application, including controllers, views, and more. It's not really relevant for the implementation we are working with in this tutorial. However, web.host is important for the implementation that we're working with here. That's the big one. This is going to be hosting the API that our client side will be communicating with. Web.core contains some shared code used by the MVC and the host project. And web.public contains, well, a separate public website. We won't be exploring that one any further in this course. The migrator project is used for database migrations with EF Core. Finally, there's also several test projects containing the unit and integration tests for the application. Since we are looking here at the server side, the web projects are really relevant here. Since it can be a bit confusing starting out with ASP.NET Zero which application does what, let me extract here the web projects. The MVC project is a regular MVC application, so it will contain controllers, views, and will typically be used in combination with jQuery. We won't be exploring that project any further in this tutorial. The public website won't be explored either. That's a separate MVC site that can be used as a landing page for the application. But as mentioned, the one that we are using in this course is the web host project, which is hosting an API for use from the Angular client-side code. In itself, it won't have any UI code in there really. Let's explore this project in a bit more detail now. The web host project in our solution is an ASP.NET Core project. As mentioned, its sole purpose in life is exposing the server-side functionality over an API. If you are familiar with building APIs with ASP.NET Core, you'll probably have built these using a controller. A controller, let's say an API controller, will expose functionality for the clients. Typically, this will result in a lot of controllers. And most of the time, these controllers don't do an awful lot. They will work with a service class and return the result of that call typically. That is why ASP.NET Zero will expose services directly as controllers. We'll see this being used when we build the application. It also falls back on a default routing schema for this, which is of course important for the way the clients will connect with these endpoints in the web host project. Time for the first demo of this module. In this demo, we are going to explore in more detail the server-side projects and focus on the web host project that will be exposing functionality for the client side. So let's now take a look at the projects that we can find in the web solution. So that is, in my case, the Acme Phonebook Demo Web Solution. When we go to the source folder, we'll see a number of projects in there. The first one is the application project. When you open it, you'll find a lot of folders. Basically, each of these folders, let's say, wrap a functionality. You can see, for example, localization, multi-tenancy, notifications, that sort of thing. Each of these are functionalities that we will have in the application, enabled by default already in the framework, that is. Now, in these folders, we'll typically find application services. For example, when I open organizations, we'll find organization unit app service. That's a class that will expose specific functionality regarding to organization units. And we'll take a look at app services later on, and we'll also need to build an application service ourselves. Next, we have the application shared project. In there, you'll typically find more or less the same folders, but in these folders, you'll now find an interface for the app service, as well as DTOs. DTOs are data transfer objects. They will be used to transfer data back and forth over the API. We will be adding our own interface and our own DTOs later in this course. In the core project, we'll find more the domain layer classes. So that will contain entities, so real business entities, as well as domain services. So typically what you'll find here is classes that have more business rule functionality, as well as the DDD parts. We will not be using that really in this application that we will be building, but ASP.NET Zero itself uses it. And if you have a more complex domain than the one that we will be using, you can also add your own domain layer classes in here. Core Shared is typically going to contain some helper classes, things like enumerations, things which are also being used in multiple locations, which is why they have been moved to a separate project. Then we have the Entity Framework Core project. As the name implies, this will contain, amongst others, the database context. Here you see the phonebook demo DB context class. That is the DB context that we will need to use and change when we add our own entities. You will find in here also all the migrations that come by default with AspNet Zero. When we later on build our own functionality, that too will probably result in a new migration being added. The migrator project can be used for database migrations. In my case, I typically use Update Database, but you could also use this migrator to perform the updates. Then we have the Web Core project. That contains a couple of classes which are going to be used across the multiple web application heads that we have in this solution. As the core name implies, this one will contain classes which are going to be used across other applications. It's also a class library. It's not a web application. For example, this contains classes that have to do with sessions. It has some helper classes. It has some configuration classes and so on. Then we have the Web Host project. The Web Host project is a very important project for the application type that we will be using. That is Angular and .NET Core. This is actually my API endpoint that my Angular code will communicate with. So you would expect here that we have a lot of controllers. Let's take a look. As you can see, there's only a very limited amount of controllers. That is because AspNet Zero uses services as controllers. Service classes, the application services that we saw earlier in the application project, will be exposing their functionality automatically so that we don't have to create a controller ourselves. A lot of times, controllers are just pass-throughs, and that is why these app services are going to be exposing their functionality directly so that the client-side Angular code can communicate with it. Then we also have the Web Public site, which is a plain AspNet MVC site that can be used as your company website. So what we looked at here was the web project. There are other solutions, including this all solution here, and that will contain more projects, including also the mobile projects. That is not relevant to what we are exploring here, so I'm not going to show you these in more detail. We've already touched upon them in the slides. Now that we have seen from a bird's eye perspective how the server-side projects work, let's now focus a bit deeper on more functionality and see how it's implemented in ASP.NET Zero. Most of this we will be looking in the next demo and also when we build the full application in the next module. ASP.NET Zero uses Entity Framework Core code first, meaning that we will be creating the entities in our code first, and then through a migration we will have the database being updated. We'll have, of course, a context for the application that acts as the traffic agent between the code and their underlying database. Handling exceptions is something that typically a lot of developers will struggle with. We need to make sure that the client-side application also handles exceptions from the server side gracefully. Both sides of this story are included in ASP.NET Zero out of the box. That means that you as a developer will typically not have to worry about all this. Another hot item that is always the subject of debate in a project is authorization. ASP.NET Zero has its own built-in authorization system which is based on permissions. The class that we'll look at later is the App Authorization Provider, which defines all permissions in the application. ASP.NET Zero uses caching. By default, it will use in-memory caching. However, for a larger system, a distributed cache might be a better solution. In that case, Redis is a good candidate. In ASP.NET Zero, it's very simple to enable the use of Redis since the support is already built in. By default, ASP.NET Zero uses Log4net for its built-in logging system. Indeed, also logging on the server side is built in the way it should, just like with all features we've covered so far. No need for you to invest time in investigating how to add the framework to your architecture. ASP.NET Zero has support for background task work using a default background job manager. However, it's easy to swap it out for another one, namely Hangfire. Throughout the application, mapping between types will need to happen, well, quite a few times. Think of entities from the database being mapped to DTOs, mappings between DTOs, and so on. The industry standard framework for this task is AutoMapper, which is used in ASP.NET Zero quite extensively. We've already touched briefly on application services, and in the demo you will be building an application service. Application services will basically be used to expose logic to the presentation layer, so in our case the API, and this way to the client. Next to application services, ASP.NET Zero also has domain services. The latter we won't be using in the demo in this tutorial, however, it's interesting to know what they are. In more complex application domains, domain services will contain the business logic and business rules. These are part of the DTD implementation in ASP.NET Zero. ASP.NET Zero also contains a lot of base classes that we can use while building our applications with the framework. For example, when we will be building an application service, we can inherit from the app service base class. And since we are working with APIs, we'll need to ensure that the calls from the client to the API can be authenticated. A typical way to do this is using tokens issued by the server. When making a call from the client, the token needs to be sent along with the request via the header. The server can then validate the token and deny access if the token is invalid, or redirect the request to the authentication endpoint. Alright, that is a lot of features. Let's return to the demo application and take a look where we can see these in code. In this demo, I'm going to show you a couple of items already that are at the heart of ASP.NET Zero. And let us start with application services or app services. Now, what is an application service really? I have one open here. It was part of the application project as we saw in the previous demo. And it is the organization unit app service. As the name implies, this is indeed an application service. Now, an application service is typically going to be used to expose logic towards the presentation layer. In our case, the application service is going to expose logic that in the end will be called via the API and used from the Angular code. Communication with this service is handled through DTOs. For example, here I have the getOrganizationUnits method that is going to return a list of DTOs. DTOs are going to be used to return and send data to this app service. This app service can also work with business logic or can also directly work with a repository. In this case, we're working with a repository directly from the app service. Notice also that my app services are going to have an interface, which was defined in the core project, by the way. This custom interface will always inherit from the iApplication service, which is part of ASP.NET Zero. Now, to work with the data, we are going to work with a code-first approach. I already showed you in the previous demo that ASP.NET Zero is based on EF Core, Entity Framework Core, the core version of Entity Framework, that is. And in this Entity Framework Core project, we have the phonebook demo DB context. That's our context that will contain a DB set for all the entities that we are working with. It also uses this onModelCreating to apply changes to the model that will be created. So this is a full code-first approach really. And this database context will be used in a lot of places, amongst others in repository classes. Here you see a repository base class that is indeed using the phonebook demo DB context. Authentication is of course a vital part for any web application, and as we'll see later in the course, authentication is done via tokens in this case, because of course we are communicating with API endpoints and the client will have to send back a token that it received earlier. This way, the server side can validate if the request is allowed or not. The handling of this token is done via this token auth controller here, which is part of the web core project. Again, this can be used for multiple web projects. That's why it is inside of the web core project. In here, we'll find a number of methods, such as authenticate, refresh token, check if the refresh token is still valid, and so on and so on. So you see here that a lot of this functionality is already built into AspNet Zero. Let's next take a look at logging. Logging is again built into AspNet Zero and by default uses Log4Net, but you can easily include another log provider if you want to. For example, let's take a look at the SMS sender class. In here, a logger will be injected. That's basically the provider model being used here. In the code, we just use this generic logger.warn, and behind the scenes, the configured logger will be handling these log messages. In an application such as AspNet Zero and also the application that you'll be building on top of AspNet Zero, a lot of mapping will need to happen. Imagine that you have a DTO that is coming into an app service. You will need to map this into an entity, for example, or into another DTO. So a lot of mapping code needs to be written. Of course, that is not something that developers get happy about. And so a framework that is commonly used for this is AutoMapper. AutoMapper is also very frequently used inside of AspNet Zero. It's not directly used. It is wrapped, let's say, in this object mapper class that is part of AspNet Zero. And to this object mapper, we can specify what type it needs to map to what other type. That's exactly what we're doing here in, for example, this role app service, part of the AspNet Zero framework. The final thing I want to show you in this demo is how authorization is handled in AspNet Zero. And for that purpose, we have the App Authorization Provider class. In this class, you will find a long list of all permissions that are available in the application, and they will all get a unique name. For example, a permission can be Pages Administration Roles Create. That is the permission name which is unique within the application. It's actually a constant that is defined elsewhere in the application. Of course, defining permissions is not useful if we don't apply them. Here we have an app service again. And notice that on the app service, we now use the ABP authorize attribute, which is very familiar with the regular authorize attribute in ASPNET Core. And it also does more or less the same thing. It will only allow access to the functionality exposed on this app service if the user can provide us with that particular permission, again with that same constant. Swagger is integrated in ASP.NET Zero. If you're not familiar with Swagger, let me quickly explain what it is and what it can do for you, both inside ASP.NET Zero and elsewhere. Swagger is an open source framework, and a large number of tools interact with it, which help developers design, build, document, and consume RESTful web services. We typically associate Swagger with the Swagger UI tool. The Swagger toolset includes support for automated documentation, code generation, and test case generation. So here you see a Swagger UI page that shows the API exposed from our server-side application in ASP.NET Zero. It's disabled by default, but we can enable it through the startup configuration of the application. As mentioned, Swagger will be used often to generate code based on the API. That will happen in the client side. So I think it's a good idea to see the Swagger endpoint visualized with Swagger UI at this point. So using Swagger, we can actually get a documentation of the API, and in this case that will be the API that is exposed by the server-side ASPNET Core application in ASP.NET Zero. Using something called Swagger UI, it's actually very easy to visualize that UI and already test the API as well. So I'm here on the swagger.io website, and you can click here to get a live demo. So this is the typical UI that you see when you have Swagger UI enabled for your application. So here you see that we have a couple of methods which are related in this case to pets. Some are related to store, user, and so on and so on. I can test all of these. For example, I can click here on this get method. And so this is the documentation about this call. It says that we will get pets based on their status. So the available values are available, pending, and sold. So I can click here on try it out now. I can then select available and then execute this call. After a couple of seconds, we get the response and we see indeed that we have received a 200 with the response body that was received in this case. So this way we get a very clean overview using Swagger UI of the API and its endpoints, and also of the responses that are returned by those endpoints. Now, ASP.NET Zero also comes with support for Swagger UI built in. It is enabled by default nowadays. So let's take a look. So let's go back to Visual Studio and run the application. And I have shown this already, but I'm going to show it again. So this will show the Swagger UI page by default. And here we see all the entities. So account, audit log, caching, and so on and so on. So those were the ones that were the folders in the application project. So basically the application services which are exposing themselves as API endpoints. Now, since these calls only allow authenticated requests, we first have to authenticate, and that too is possible. You can see here that I'm currently logged in, and then I can launch my requests authenticated. Now, Swagger is something that needs to be enabled in ASP.NET Core and thus also in ASP.NET Zero. Here we're looking at the startup file, and here we see that we are adding Swagger to the services collection, so basically to the dependency injection collection with a number of options and parameters. And next, we also need to enable Swagger. And that is done here, down here in the configure method, where I call use Swagger to enable the middleware. And then I also do the same thing for the Swagger UI. Testing. So automated testing, unit testing. Everyone knows we need to do it. But a lot of us say, well, let's do some manual testing, or let's have our testers figure out if something goes wrong. While it happens a lot, it is definitely not a good approach. Setting up your test infrastructure in code can sometimes be a bit of a hassle. In ASP.NET Zero, a solid testing foundation, including unit tests and integration tests, has already been created for you, which makes it easier for us to continue building on that. The included unit tests are based on the XUnit testing framework. For assertions, another library called shouldly is used. An often heard concern with unit testing is, what should I be testing? Should I test everything? Well, in the included testing foundation, domain and application layers are being tested, which is, in my humble opinion, the part where you should invest your testing budget in. You shouldn't be testing if ASP.NET itself works. Microsoft has already done that for you. We will be looking at writing unit tests in the next module when we create our application. Here you can see a sample unit test. Unit tests will derive from AppTestBase, a base class included in ASP.NET Zero. That's a base class which already does some of the preparation work for you, including setting up a fake in-memory database, seed it with initial data, and provide methods to easily work with the context. Let's, in the last demo for the server-side section, take a look at the included unit tests. In this demo, I'm going to show you how ASP.NET Zero handles unit testing. Now, out of the box in the blank project, there are already quite a few unit tests available. And we can actually look at these unit tests to see how we can then do our own unit tests. We will write our own unit tests, by the way, in the next chapter. So when you collapse the entire solution, you'll find a test solution folder, and in there you'll find phonebook demo tests. That is, of course, the unit testing project. Let's open that and let's take a look at the dependencies. And let's take a look at the NuGet packages that are being used here. This gives away some more information about the unit tests. We can see here that ASP.NET Zero uses XUnit as its unit testing framework. Next, we also see shouldly, which is an assertion framework. And it also uses the ASP boilerplate test base, which is basically a framework, a testing framework, let's say, to make it easier to do integration testing for ASP.NET Zero projects. Finally, there's also a reference to SQLite, Entity Framework Core SQLite actually. SQLite is being used as an in-memory database here for mocking Entity Framework and database operations. All right, let us now take a look at some of these unit tests. So what is actually being tested? Well, let me open authorization here and then users. And let us now take a look at the user app service delete tests. Of course, the user app service handles all the operations around adding users, deleting users, updating users, and so on. So this is typically something that should be well tested. And as you can see, there's already a long list of unit tests that has been written around this functionality. So what is actually being tested? To be clear, it's typically the app services, so the ones that we'll be writing in the next module. And if you have more complex domain services, well, those will be unit tested as well. And that's exactly what we will see here. Let's take a look at one of these tests. In this test, we are going to delete a user and verify that after the deletion code has run, the user will also be deleted. What I'm doing first is I'm going to create a user and then I'm going to check whether or not I can find that user. The create test users is actually a separate method that is going to create a set of sample users. So then I check if the user can be found. So that is all still a range code. Then in the act block, we will do the actual testing. We are going to delete the user with that given ID. Finally, we're going to use the same call again to check if that user is actually now deleted. So let's now run this test. So as you can see here, my unit test, the user app service delete tests, has successfully run. Now that we have a good understanding of how the server-side infrastructure in an ASP.NET Zero application works, it's time for some exploration of the client side of things. So, in the next part of this module, we are going to explore the Angular part. As a small recap, let's take another look at the overall architectural diagram that we looked at in the beginning of this module. We just explored the ASP.NET Core part, so the server-side part. Let's now turn our attention to the Angular part, so the part on the left. The typical flow will be indeed that the Angular app will connect with the backend first to perform authentication based on a token. Once that's all good and the user has successfully been authenticated, the user modules within the Angular app will perform API calls, passing in the token so that the server can validate the calls and only allow them through if they are authenticated. We'll look in more detail at the authentication used in ASP.NET Zero later in this module. Just like a regular Angular application, ASP.NET Zero contains several modules. There is one application level module, the root module, used for bootstrapping the Angular app. This can be found in the main.module.ts file. A very important module is the account module. As the name gives away, this module will contain the logic for the authentication-related features such as login, registration, password reset, and so on. Next, we have the app module, which basically wraps all other modules in the application. By default, it contains the main module and the admin module. Through the pages inside the admin module, users will be able to manage users, roles, languages, settings, and so on. These are already pre-created for you. Next, we have the important main module. Here we will be creating our actual application. When you have just generated your application, it will contain a sample dashboard page. That we've already seen. I hope you remember. Of course, that page is there just for demo purposes. You can delete it. Your application code will typically contain multiple smaller modules. That's the recommended approach to work, so you can lazy load functionality on demand. Modules will typically be accessible through a route. For example, /app/admin for the admin module. As mentioned, Angular supports lazy loading of routes, meaning that only when the user browses to that part of the application, the related code will be loaded. That, of course, brings with it a faster startup time for the application. When our client application loads, of course, it needs to know where its backend is going to be. This information is available for the Angular application in the appconfig.json file in the remote service base URL setting. The other related setting you can see here is the app base URL, which is the URL the application itself runs on. That's a setting which the application typically will need to know if it runs in a multi-tenancy mode. Before we go back to the demo, I want to zoom in a little bit more on the default modules, which we already touched upon briefly, so the account module and the app module. And let's start with the account module. In your source code, you will be able to find this module under the account folder. The account component is the root component for the module. And in the account routing module, you'll find the different routes for the subcomponents. In this module, you'll find several pages and components which will give you application account functionality, including login, registration, forgot password, and email activation. The default built-in UI that comes with AspNet Zero already looks very nice. Here you can see an example of the login component. If we configure the application to support multiple tenants, from this screen it will also be possible to make the tenant selection. A change of password option is also built in. And on this screenshot, you can see the registration page, secured with a reCAPTCHA so that bots will have a harder time registering for the application in an automated way. A key is required to use this from Google, and that key should end up in your appsettings.json file. It's not shown in this screenshot, but AspNet Zero also supports social logins, which can be configured from the backend of the application. Once configured, they will show up here in the UI. AspNet Zero also has support for two-factor authentication built in. In these times of security breaches and account theft, that's definitely a good thing. By default, it's disabled, but you can, as an administrator, enable it for the website. Support is included for email, SMS, and the Google Authenticator verification at the time of the creation of this tutorial. Let's go back to Visual Studio for another demo and take a look at the functionality coming from the account module. So let us now take a look, before we look at the code, at the running application again, so that you have a clear idea of what we are looking at. When I go to localhost 4200, it will redirect me to account/login, and then I arrive on this login page. Here I can of course log in, we've already seen that, and next to logging in, I can also go from here and create a new account. So I'll then go to account register. Here I can enter my details, prove that I'm not a robot, and then I can submit, and then I have a new account in the website. Let's take a look at the components for this functionality. So I am here in Visual Studio Code, and under source, we can expand this and we'll see account. Under the account module, which is like a main module, we have a couple of other sub-modules that have to do with login, the registration, and other ones that I haven't shown you here, which is email activation, payment, and password reset. Now, under account, we'll also find the code that handles the entire account module. First, we have the account component. That's basically the root component for the entire account module. In the account routing module, we'll find the routes that are defined for the account module. Here you see the different routes, and those were the ones that we were hitting, login and register, and they were loading the corresponding component, one of the components in the submodules. Then we have the account component HTML. Now this one is actually pretty empty. It doesn't do an awful lot, but it does have the router outlet over here. And the router outlet is basically the placeholder for the real component that we are going to load in. And the actual content is of course loaded via the account routing module, which points to the corresponding component that will be loaded in. Let's take a look at one of these submodules here. So in the login, we have the login component itself, which is the functionality for all that has to do with the login screen that we just saw. In here, we are using the login service. The login service will contain the actual functionality to perform the communication with the backend. This, of course, contains the actual authentication logic that will then communicate with our API. Next to the component, you of course have the login component HTML, so the template, and that contains of course the HTML code for the login page. It will use bindings here to capture the values entered in the UI for the email address or username, password, remember me, and so on. Now, all the other components, I'm not going to show you them in here in detail. They are pretty much the same, but I do recommend that you explore this code at your own pace. Next to the account module, we have the probably more important app module. This is the real meat of the application, where the user will end up after entering username and password. It contains the admin module, the main module, and the shared module. In the main module, as I already said, by default a dashboard page is shown by default, which you can see here on the screenshot in the middle of the screen. That is nothing more than a placeholder really. Through these submodules, the app module will deliver a lot of the functionality that is available in the application by default. Layout and menu come from the shared part. We can also manage additions, so different versions of functionality. This is typically used in combination with a multi-tenant system. Managing different tenants is also done from here, as well as role and user management. Another feature we get through the app module is language management, giving us the ability to manage languages and translations dynamically. Notifications to users can also be managed from here, as well as settings. Settings is a very wide aspect that includes things such as visual settings used to manage how an application looks for end users. Now, this list is far from complete. The app module contains more abilities than what I've shown here. Although we will look at things in a demo in just a minute, I've collected here some screenshots that will give you a better idea on the options offered by the app module. Here you can see role management. Role management allows us to drill down to the level of permissions for roles on pages. So we can, for example, enable the permission to add a phone number to a customer. That's the fine-grained level that we can reach with permissions. Here you can see a screenshot of user management. Users are typically tied to roles and can then work in the application based on the permissions the roles have. In other words, users will be in a role typically, and a user can typically be in 0 or more roles. If he or she is in multiple roles, the received permissions are the union of these separate permissions retrieved based on the role. While we will most commonly work based on roles, it's also possible to assign permissions on the user level. Finally, here you can see a screenshot of the language management screen. Here we can enable or disable certain languages in the application, and per language, it's also possible to create translations within the running application. So, fully dynamically. Although the other features are pretty cool, I find this to be a great feature, adding to the flexibility of the application. Time for another demo, where we will look at the code for the application module and its submodules. We'll also take a look at some of the management screens in a running instance of the application. So in the previous demo, we explored the account module. Now let's collapse that one and let's go to the other modules. Basically, as you can see here, most of the functionality will actually live inside of this app module. This is the module that once we have logged in, we will reach, let's say. So this is actually the app module. This is also the place where you will be writing your own functionalities, and therefore under app module, you will be writing most of your own code as well. Now under app, there are in fact 3 submodules: the admin, the main, and then the shared. The app component is in fact the root component for all things under the app module. Let's take a look first at the shared module. Under shared, we'll find, amongst others, the nav folder here. And in there, we'll find the sidebar menu component. This one will be the one that will be showing the items here on the left. Very soon we'll be adding our own menu item, and we'll have to link that with a route. But we'll do that in the next module. Under the admin, we'll find a lot of functionality that has to do with, well, typical administrator tasks for the website. For example, under roles, we'll find the functionality that allows us to add and edit roles. In the actual application, we'll find all these administration functions under administration. For example, when I click here on roles, I will see the list of roles that we currently have. I can create a new role here. Let's call it sample role. I can also select the permissions. That's again another administration task that I can do. I can automatically assign permissions to this role so that when users will be assigned to this role, they will automatically get these permissions. And by the way, these permissions, I hope you remember from earlier in this module, are actually defined on the server side using the app authorization provider. Let's save the role here and then the role will be added. And all the functionality for that can be found here under the roles component. Next to roles, we can of course also work with users. Under the users folder, we'll find the component that allows us to do that. If we go here in the website again, we'll click on users and we'll see that we currently only have an admin user. We can create a new user here. We can create a user by entering the data in all these fields. There's also a couple of options that we can enable or disable. We can also assign the user to a role, so by default this user will become a user because that role was set to default. And finally, we can also assign the user in an organization unit. We also have the ability to work with languages. Now, AspNet Zero allows me to add translations on the fly in my application. That's a very cool feature. Let me show that to you. So we go here to languages, and then as you can see, we have all the languages that are currently supported. See, the language can be enabled or disabled and can also be set to default. I can then click on one of the languages. I actually speak Dutch, so I can edit this language here. As you can see, I can now change these values, these translated values on the fly. Now while we're at it, we can also change other, let's say, visual things in the visual settings. Here we can change the colors, change the header bar, change the menu and the footer. These are basically UI settings that we can change. And you can also see that we can apply a different theme to our application. Under host settings, we can change other settings for the website. For example, we can change the logo, we can apply custom CSS. We can, for example, also from here set up how email should be sent. So as you can see, there's a lot of settings that you can work with, and all the code for these things can be found under the app module. We've now looked at the built-in modules and what functionality they offer. There are a couple of technical topics I want you to understand before we start building our application together, and that will make our life easier in the next module. First, client-side package management. Angular applications most commonly use npm to manage dependencies. We've talked about installing npm in the previous module. However, at the time of the creation of this course, there are some known issues with npm. So a better alternative now is yarn, which is fully compatible with npm. Yarn is another client-side package manager. Using yarn, we can easily manage packages in the application, so adding, removing, and so on. ASP.NET Zero is also configured by default to use the Angular CLI, which, if you've never used it, is the command line interface for Angular development and deployment. For us, developers, the good news is that things have already been pre-configured, again in ASP.NET Zero, to work with the CLI, allowing us to just type npm start, which will kick off compilation and deployment. I will see this in the demo in just a minute here. Finally, remember that we looked earlier in this module at Swagger, which described all the endpoints of the API in ASP.NET Core? I'm sure you do. Now, we've said earlier that our Angular app will communicate with the API. Of course, it's a SPA. In a real-life, larger applications, such as the ones built with ASP.NET Zero, we'll have a lot of requests going from the client to the server. All of these are basically AJAX requests. While there may be a lot of these requests, the code that we'll have to write to communicate with these endpoints will often be very similar. Similar code. That sounds like something that we could automate, I guess. Well, indeed, instead of typing all the boilerplate code, we can use a tool called nswag, which will, let's say, hook into the Swagger endpoint created in ASP.NET Core. It's already configured in the application for use through a bat file, so a batch file that we can run. When doing so, it will look at the service classes we have in the server application and generate proxies for us in the Angular application in TypeScript. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code and see nswag in action. So in this demo, I'm going to show you briefly how we can work with NSWAG, which will then generate client-side code for us. The first thing, of course, is for NSWAG to work, it actually needs to talk with the running instance of the server-side application. So I'm here in Visual Studio, and therefore I need to run my server-side ASPNet Core API. So here's the Swagger page that indicates that the API is up and running and it's waiting for incoming requests. So let's now jump to Visual Studio Code. Under NSWAG, there's a file called refresh.bat, a batch file that is. So I need to go to that particular folder and run this refresh.bat, and I can do that directly here from Visual Studio Code. So I'm now in the NSWAG directory, and now I can call refresh.bat. And this was very quick, as you could see. Now, why is that? Well, at this point, I haven't made any changes to my application services on the server side, and therefore the generation doesn't need to do an awful lot. Now, in the next module, we will be creating our own application services, and then you'll see that client-side code will actually get generated when I execute this command. Now, where is the generated code going to end up then? Well, let's scroll all the way down to shared and then service proxies. And there you'll find a file called service proxies, a TypeScript file. And that's a pretty long file that gets generated by NSWAG. And this file will get updated in the next module where we add our own application services. One final aspect that I want to highlight here is the authentication part, which is typically a source for a lot of questions and even confusion for developers. We are working with the client and the server-side part of the application, and of course, all the real authentication happens on the server side. But of course, the server side is an API exposing endpoints, and those need to be secured against unallowed access. We can do this easily by enabling token-based authentication. In this approach, we need to authenticate the client against an open endpoint that will receive from the client the username and password. That communication needs to happen, of course, over HTTPS, since this information will go over the line in clear text. The server can then validate if the provided credentials are okay, and if so, it will generate a token for the Angular app to use with subsequent requests. This token is sent along with every request as part of the header. Let's take a look at this process in action in the next demo. So in this demo, I'm going to show you how we can authenticate from the client-side code, so from the Angular code into our API. Now, there's going to be a two-step process, because first we need to get access to the authentication token, the bearer token that will be sent back from the API. That token we can then use in subsequent requests to authenticate to our API and get a JSON response. So let me show you the calls that will actually take place. First, there's going to be an authentication call. We are going to do a post, and we're going to do that to, in this case, our local host /API/tokenauth/authenticate. In the headers, we need to specify that the content type will be application JSON, and the abp.tenantID header should also be set to 1. Now I do need to add here that the multi-tenancy for this to work needs to be disabled, but we already did that earlier in this course. In the body, we will then send over the JSON containing the username and the password. And that's what you see here. I'm sending username or email address, set that to admin, and then the password, that's the password that I have changed earlier in this module. Okay, let's send that post request. And we are getting back a result that contains an access token. That is the access token that our Angular code is going to use for subsequent requests to the API. And we can test that out as well. Let's copy that token here. And I'll go to my test API call here. Of course, what I'm going to show you here will work with just any API call. I've selected the get users call that will basically return me a list of all registered users on the site. I need to add more headers. Again, the abp.tenantID is required, and then the authorization will contain the bearer token. And that needs to be in the format bearer, then a space, and then the actual bearer value. I'll paste in the new value of the bearer token. Hit enter, and now I can click on send. And there we go. We see the result coming back from the API call. And remember, this call required me to be authenticated. That's why I needed to send in that bearer token. And what I've shown you here is the exact same way that the Angular code will use to communicate with my API. In the final section of this module, I want to introduce you to tooling called ASP.NET Zero Power Tools created by the ASP.NET Zero team to help us in creating new applications with ease. Although in the next module, we will see how things are done manually, it's interesting to see how a tool can already do a lot of the code generation for you, making your life a bit easier. Do note that all that we will see here can be done in a manual way, and that's exactly what we will be doing in the next module. ASP.NET Zero Power Tools can be used to generate or scaffold code starting from ASP.NET Zero 5.1. It exists as an extension in the Visual Studio Marketplace. On the screenshot here, you can see the interface of the tool. Using the tooling, you can, in an automated way, generate the files necessary to create new functionality in an ASP.NET Zero application. If you use the tooling to generate functionality, it will generate both client and server-side code. The net result will be that a new screen within the Angular application will be generated and basic operations on this entity are also supported. Like that, scaffolding, but on steroids. Here's another screenshot that shows the edit screen, also generated or scaffolded by the tooling. As said, the tooling will perform code generation on the client and server side. If the entity that we are working with is called car, well then on the server side, the following classes will get generated. Some of the server-side files in your project will also get updated. These include the database context as well as the classes that have to do with the permissions. Running the tooling will also generate a database migration. Next to the server-side code, also client-side code will be generated. Here you see a list of all client-side files that will get generated. And just like on the server, files will get modified on the client as well. The generated code will also get referenced from the parent module. As the final demo in this module, let's take a look at the ASP.NET Zero Power Tools in action. Let me show you how we can work with the ASP.NET Zero Power Tools, and keep in mind that some of the things I will be showing may actually be a little bit complex, but we'll get to them in the next module in a lot more depth. So don't panic if you cannot follow along with everything I'm doing at this point. It's just to give you an idea of the ASP.NET Zero Power Tools. So to get started, you go to the Visual Studio Marketplace, and there you'll need to search for ASP.NET Zero Power Tools. You can then click here on the download button, and that will give you the Visual Studio installer file. Simply double click and it will install the extension into Visual Studio. Please keep in mind that it's best not to have Visual Studio running when installing the extension. So let me now show you the Power Tools in action. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the download page, and from here I'm going to download the latest version based on this Angular version and .NET Core version, and then I click here on Generate Demo Project. I've already used the Acme Phonebook project name, which is what we will be doing in the next module for the entire manual build of the application as well. I have already done that, and I've extracted that into this Phonebook demo folder here. In here we find two projects. Again, we'll dive deeper into these projects in much more detail in the next module. But for now, I'm going to go to ASP.NET Core, and in here I'll select the web solution. Now, using the ASP.NET Zero Power Tools, a lot of code will get generated and a migration will also be executed for me. In fact, it will also run an update database so that everything is basically already in place. Now, in order for an update database to work, we need to go to the web host project and go to the app settings.json. And in here, I'll need to make sure that I have my connection string set correctly. So I'm going to update that here because I'm running here on local DB. And I'm going to name the database Power Tools Test Demo, and the rest is basically default. Save that. Let's do a quick build to make sure that everything already works and that the packages have been restored. That all seems to be perfect. All right, now we're going to use the Power Tools. So we go to Tools, ASP.NET Zero, and then we click here on Create Entity. Here we can now create our entity. The namespace for our application is going to be Phonebook. The entity I want to create in this demo is called Person. It's possible to give a different name for the plural of the entity name. In this case, I'll leave it as is, but I could name this People. The database name I'll leave as default Persons. It's going to be a base entity, and the primary key is going to be an integer. I also ask to do a migration as well as an update database. So the database will be automatically brought in sync. I'm also going to ask to generate a UI already. That's going to be in the Angular part of the application. I'm going to create a user interface with some extra options here, and I also want to put this in the root menu. I also enable the multi-tenancy. Then I'm going to go to the Properties tab, and I'm going to add a couple of properties for my entity. I'm going to start with a first name string. I can filter on that. I can select to show or hide this in the UI, and I can also specify some attributes. For example, this value should always be between 1 and 100 characters. Alternatively, I could also add a regular expression here, and I'm going to make this one required. I'm going to do pretty much the same for the last name. I'm also going to set that the length should be between 1 and 100 characters. Also make that required. I can also add a different type of property. For example, I'm going to add a date time here, the birth date. And finally, I'm going to add an email. And I could specify here also a regex to verify in the server-side code that this is effectively an email address. I'm going to skip that for now. And I'm going to click this button, Generate. This is going to do a lot of things for me. It's going to generate a lot of files, and it's going to also try to update the database. Let's try that. So it's now running the migration. Now it's going to update the database. The migrations have been applied, and also the client-side components and HTML code has been generated. We can now close this, and now I can safely run the backend. And now I can see the Swagger UI for the backend. Now in the folder here, we also had the Angular code. Let's open this folder in VS Code. So I'm going to come here to Visual Studio, and I'm going to click Open Folder, and I'll navigate to my Angular code. In the terminal window, make sure that we install all the required packages by running npm I. Once that is ready, there's one thing that in my case doesn't happen automatically. It might change, of course, in the next version, but make sure that with the API running, you navigate to the nswag directory by typing cd nswag, and in there call refresh.bat. This will make sure that the client-side code is up to date with what is available on the server side. With that all done, we can now call npm start. The application will now get compiled and we'll be able to browse it using localhost 4200. Let's go to the browser and take a look at the running application. We'll need to log in with the default, which is admin123QWE, since this is of course a new application. Now I see here in the menu persons. This was generated by the AspNet Zero Power Tools. I can create a new person. As you see, based on the type, it will show me different UI to enter the data. Click on Save. This person now appears here. I can edit that person. I can filter the list of persons. When I type GI, it will find it, but when I type something completely different, it will not show here. You also see that we have the ability to page the result as well as do an export to Excel. So all of this code, both client and server side, has been generated for me. And it is plain code. You can go ahead in Visual Studio as well as Visual Studio Code, start editing this code. Phew! That was a long module. I hope that you have picked up a lot of new things working with ASP.NET Zero. We've looked at the code for the client and the server side, and I hope that you have seen that ASP.NET Zero already creates a solid foundation for your application, which lends itself to testing as well. Throughout the entire application, both client and server side, best practices and industry standard frameworks have been used, giving you all the needed access to tweak the framework in the way you want to tweak it. Finally, we've also looked at the Power Tools, a plugin in Visual Studio that will put you on your way to create new functionality. In the next module, we will now work on creating an application in the manual way, which is what you will be doing most of the time. I hope to see you there as well. Alright, time for another module in the ASP.NET Zero tutorial called Building Single-Page Applications with ASPNET Core and Angular. I'm Jill Clearan, and I will be guiding you through this module as well. So, this is it. In the previous modules, we have been building up your knowledge so that you understand the basics of ASP.NET Zero, some of its inner workings and tooling used to build applications. In this module, we are going to put that knowledge to work in a very practical way. We are going to build your first end-to-end ASP.NET Zero application. So, by the end of this module, you will be the proud creator of a fully working app based on ASP.NET Zero. So let's keep the tradition in place and kick off the module by looking at what we are going to do. In fact, the agenda is very simple. I'm going to start by quickly showing you again what we are going to be building in this module, so the finished application. And then, the bulk of this module will be building that very application. So let's get our hands dirty. So what are we going to build then? In fact, I have already shown you in the very beginning of this course, but that's a long time ago, isn't it? The application we will be building is pretty simple, but it will highlight all the aspects of development using ASP.NET Zero. We're going to create a new functionality in the application for a phone book. This will basically allow us to show a list of people, so person instances returned from the API. Each of these person instances will also have one or more phone numbers attached to them. It's the goal of this demo to be able to manage the information in here. So that means both the person instances as well as the phone instances attached to person instances. In order to ensure that we're all on the same page here, let's take another quick look at the finished application that we will be building in the rest of this module. Alright, let me get you a little bit excited about what you're going to learn in this module. Here you see the finished application that we're going to build. We are showing the list of people that we have in our application. That is on the back end, of course. We can filter these people. We can, of course, remove the filter again. We can add a new person. Hit save and that person will show up here in the list. I can also edit that newly added person. I can manage the phone numbers for this person. If he already has phone numbers, they will show up here as well. And I can also delete the person after getting this confirmation. That is what you will be building in this module with me. Okay, time to get to work. While we will be spending the most of our time in Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, I have created a couple of slides that will outline which tasks we need to perform. This will make it easier for you to follow the steps. Alright, we're going to create this application, you and me, together. We can do this. In the demo, we'll start from an empty, freshly downloaded application. That will look exactly the same as we've already explored in the previous module. In that application, in the first part of this demo, we are going to be adding a new menu item containing a label and an icon. And by clicking on that menu item, the page on the right will be showing. So what are the things we need to do for this to work? So first, we are going to create a menu item in the Angular application. You'll see that it already contains menu items as part of the navigation service, and so we'll need to bring in a new one. Now everything in ASP.NET Zero can be localized, and so that includes this menu item as well. To bring in a translated value for this label, we're going to have to translate the value on the server side. Next, we will be leveraging the routing system of Angular, so that we will be able to click on the newly created menu item. And when the item is clicked, well, then we'll want to load a page, or should I say view, which will be backed by an Angular component. So as mentioned, the ASP.NET Zero framework relies on the infrastructure of the underlying frameworks, and that's no different here for the routing part. Angular has this thing called a router. The Angular router allows navigating from one view to the next. Typically, this will happen based on the URL, which is based on the router to know where it needs to navigate to next. Typically, it will be triggered from links on the page, just as we have here in our application. Extra data, so parameters, can be passed along. In the application, we will be adding a route that will indicate which component needs to be loaded. Take a look at the link at the bottom here, if the concept of routing in Angular is still a bit unclear for you. Now, next we will be creating our first Angular component. The concept of a component is probably the most important thing to understand. A component contains logic that will control a screen or a part thereof. So we can have a component that controls the menu of the screen, another component can control the logic for our phone book, and so on. Angular components will be wrapped inside a class. And on this class, we will define properties and methods that can be used by the view to interact with it. In the first demo of this module, we will start from a blank application and will create the menu item, its translation, the component, and the route. So it is time to get started on building that application that we looked at in the previous demo. Make sure at this point that you are logged out. If you had the application running, please make sure that you've logged out so that we don't run into any issues there. And another thing that you need to disable at this point is the multi-tenancy. Take a look at the phonebook demo constants class in the core shared and notice that I have the multi-tenancy enabled set to false. So the first thing that I'm going to do, as mentioned in the slides, is build up that component. And there's a couple of things that we need to do. First, of course, we need to add the ability to see that component. Let's go to Visual Studio Code and we're going to start writing some code here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new menu item that will appear in the menu as you saw before. To add that menu item, I need to go to App, Shared, and then Layout. In there you'll find the folder Nav. And in there you'll find App Navigation Service. What you see here is the code that builds up the app menu. I hope you recognize the dashboard, the administration, which had some submenu items such as roles and users that we looked at earlier in this course. I'm going to add my own app menu item here. And let's add it behind this dashboard menu item. So what have I now just brought in? Well, I have added a new app menu item which has as name phonebook. The null means at this point that we don't have any permissions set for this app menu item. So basically everyone will be able to see it at this point. The third parameter is the icon that I use from the built-in set. And the fourth parameter, so /phonebook, is the route. And we'll have to build the route in just a minute. If we run the application at this point, we'll already see our menu item appearing. Let's give it a shot. So I'm going to run npm start to run the application and then browse the localhost 4200. So we can now log in with the credentials that we have used before. And there we go, our phonebook menu item is already available. It has the icon as well as the text. But it doesn't do anything at this point just yet. We'll have to fix that. Alright, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. I have to follow a couple of steps in order to make my menu item work. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to localize the menu item. And for that, I have to go back to Visual Studio because localization is handled on the server side, of course. Here's my server-side application. I'm still running it, so let me stop it here. And I need to go to the core project. In the core project, you'll find this localization folder. In there, we have the phonebook demo folder, which contains XML files, and those will contain localization strings. Let's first go to the default one. That is this one, the phonebookdemo.xml. This one contains the English, let's say the default translations. As you can see, there's no suffix behind the name of the file. I can now add the translation that I want. So I'll add here text name equals phonebook and the translation between the open and close tag just in the same way as the other translations are already in this file. I'll put it right over here. It doesn't really matter where you put this. Now, if you don't translate my new text, well then this default value will always be used. But I can also add another translation. I'm from Belgium and I speak Dutch, so that is the NL translation. So let's go here. In my case, I'll add the same string here, but I'll put the translation in my native tongue. I suggest you do the same with your own native language. The next thing I'll do is I'll add a route in the Angular code, because we need to know where the application should navigate, which component it should be loading when we click on our new menu item. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Now, AspNet Zero defines its routes in a number of places. In this case, I'm going to make it simple and I'm going to add the phonebook page in the main module of the application. That contains a number of routes. Let me show you. So we go to Source, App, then Main, and in there you'll find the main routing module. Currently, there's one route in here that specifies that the dashboard component should be loaded when we navigate to dashboard. Well, we're going to do pretty much the same with our phonebook. Let's add another route. There we go. We've added a route that says that we need to load the phonebook component when we go to phonebook. At this point, the compilation will fail, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, because Angular is complaining that it cannot find the phonebook component. So let's do that next. We are going to create the phonebook component. We're going to create our new component under the main folder, and in there I'm going to create my own folder for phonebook. So under main, create a new folder, phonebook, and let's add a new component here. Let's call that the phonebook component. So I'll call my file phonebook.component.ts. Let me paste in some code in this component. And of course, this requires some Angular knowledge, but for the rest, it's nothing really that special. Probably the most striking thing is that my component inherits here from app component base. That's a base class that comes with the AspNet Zero framework. It already contains a couple of functionalities, including localization, and we'll use that very soon. You can omit inheriting from this base class, but it's going to make your life a little bit easier. And remember that we had an error in the main routing module. It was complaining that it couldn't find the phonebook component. Well, we've now added it, so let's go back there and let's make sure that the application compiles again. Visual Studio Code's IntelliSense will now suggest that I'm going to import my phonebook component. And there we go, we've added this import statement, but now Angular is complaining that it cannot find the template. And it's absolutely right in saying that. We haven't created that file, so let's do that next. So I'm going to go back here and create a phonebook template. Here you see the code for the template of our new phonebook component. I need to point out a couple of things. Notice the L and then phonebook. Now what is the L all about? Well, the L, the lowercase l, is going to be a function that localizes the string that we pass to it, phonebook. And remember that that was the key that we specified earlier in the XML file. Another thing I need to point out is this router transition attribute that is used to show a little animation when we do transitions between pages. For the rest, it is just plain HTML, and as you can see, there is a placeholder that says that our actual phonebook component is going to be pasted in here. At this point, we've added the component, we've added the route, but we haven't linked our component with a module just yet. So we'll need to do that next. In my case, I'm going to link my component via the main module. In here, I'm going to bring in my phonebook component. Let me import it first. There we go. At this point, it's still grayed out because we're not using it just yet. I need to fix that. I need to go to my declarations, which is going to let my module know about my component. There we go. If we now take a look at the application again, we'll see our component already working. Let's try it out. So I have my phonebook item here. I click on it and there we go. We see our component, we see the template, we've added our first component to our ASPNet Zero application. How great is that? Now we are going to turn our attention to the server side, where we'll need to create an entity for the person class that we are going to work with. ASP.NET Zero is of course based on .NET Core and has support for a code-first approach. That entity will also need to be added to the database context. Once that is done, we'll create a migration and ensure that the database is up to date. By default, this database table won't contain any data just yet, so we'll need some data seeding to bring in the initial data. Let us return to Visual Studio this time and perform some server-side changes in the application. So we are now going to create a server-side entity and we're also going to add a migration. So of course, we are back in Visual Studio to make these changes. First, I'm going to add my entity, and those are going to live in the core project. Under the core project, I'm going to create a new folder. And it may not surprise you that I'm going to call that folder phonebook. In there, I'm going to create my entity called person. I'm going to add a new class, name it person, and I'm going to bring in some code. When I paste in this snippet, Visual Studio is complaining about a couple of missing using statements. So let's fix that first. There we go, it is happy again. Now the first thing you notice is that my person class is inheriting from the full audited entity base class. Let's take a look at this base class. As you can see here, I'm inheriting from full audited entity in int, because my person class is going to have an integer key. And this base class brings in support for some auditing properties for creation, modification, and deletion. And what you see here is also that we have an isDeleted property. When I will later on delete a person, it will not really get deleted. Instead, this boolean will get set to false. Next, you also see that the name and surname are required, and all of these properties also use the max length property, pointing to a constant that I have defined at the top. Now let's go to our database context, where I'll add a DB set for this person class. I hope you remember we now need to go to the Entity Framework core project, and in there we'll find our DB context, the phonebook demo DB context. In here we'll add our DB set for person. And let's bring in a reference to the person class. I should now do a build and then we can add the migration. Everything has built successfully, that's good. So now we can go to the Package Manager console and add our migration. So here in the Package Manager console, I'll type add migration. I'll specify the name. What have I done here? I've added the person table. So I'll give the migration a name, added persons table. Make sure that you set the default project to the Entity Framework core project, since that is the one that contains the DB context. Let's hit enter now and let's create the migration. Let's take a look at the migration first. Here's the migration. In the migration, we can see that a table called PBPersons is going to be created. Now, where's that name coming from? Well, take a look here. We have added the table attribute to the person class. And in there, we specified the name of the table we wanted to create. Here we then see the table's structure that is going to be created. We can now run the update database statement. Now the update database has succeeded. Let's take a look at our database. So I'm going to go here because I'm using LocalDB to the SQL Server Object Explorer. And in there, I'll find my database. It is the phonebook demo database. In there, I'll find a new table, PBPersons. At this point, there won't be any data in that table just yet. Of course, we have just created the table. So how can we now create the table so we can later on see a couple of default persons added to my database? Well, I'm going to do some seeding. Now, when I say seeding, I'm basically specifying that I'm going to create a class that is going to feed initial data into my database. Now, where are we supposed to put that class? Well, let me show you. Under Migrations Seed, we find a host folder. In there are already some seed classes. I'm going to add my own class here, the initial people creator, because that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create new person instances. So I say add new class, and let's call this class initial people creator. Let's make this class public. And let's paste in some code here. So what is this class going to do? Well, it is going to use the phonebook demo DB context. I need to bring that in, by the way. There we go. It is going to be injected using dependency injection. And then I'm going to create a couple of person instances on my persons DB set on my context. You, of course, also need to bring in support for a link. There we go. And finally, I also need to bring in support for the person class. Now I have a couple of hard-coded persons that are going to be inserted into my database. I seem to have made a mistake here by pasting in one curly brace too many. Let's delete that. Of course, just creating this class won't do any magic. We still need to call this class from somewhere. So we can call the initial host DB builder. In there, I'm going to now specify that I want a new initial people creator passing in the context and also calling its create method. So we specify here new initial people creator. We pass in the context, that's the DB context, and then we call create. Notice that this class is going to be responsible for saving the changes that we've made to the DB context. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the application, and then we'll see if this code actually got executed, so it seeded this initial data into our database. Let's do that now. So I've now loaded up the application. Let's take a look at SQL Server Object Explorer again, and open the persons table again. View data, we don't see anything, but let's refresh. There we go. Our person instances are now in the database. You can see those names here at the very end. That seems to have worked. Let's go back to the slides for now. Edit input. And for the sake of simplicity, I'll put those in this file as well. There we go. At this point, the app service is also happy. All the required types are now found. Let's go back to the custom DTO mapper and add these custom mappings. Now, in fact, I should say to you at this point, we don't really need those because they would actually work out of the box. But just for the sake of completeness, let's add these mappings as well. Let's run at this point the API again. And because we made changes in the server side, let's go back to nswag and let it run again. Now, to allow support for editing a person, I'm going to add another HTML file here. I've called it the Edit Person Modal component. As the name implies, this will be another modal pop-up that allows me to edit the person properties. This is a pretty simple piece of HTML that is just going to visualize the person name, surname, and email address. You of course need to call this from the phonebook component. I'm going to add another button here. There we go. That allows me to edit the person, so the phone numbers, and also edit the person via the modal window. And just like we did with the create person modal, I'm going to also bring in my edit person modal dialog here. Of course, at this point, this will not be found, so we need to bring in another component for that modal dialog. That's going to be the edit person modal component. This has a selector edit person modal so that Angular knows that this edit person modal should be handled via this component here. The code for this is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend any time on it. You of course need to now also let Angular know about this modal component. So we need to go back to the main module. And we earlier added support for the phonebook component as well as the create person modal component. And now we need to bring in the edit person modal component. And add another import here as well. With this in place, we should now be able to run the application again and edit persons as well. And now I can click here on edit person. And now the dialog is effectively showing, allowing me to edit my person. With this in place, we now have a fully working application. How cool is that? So far, we haven't looked at the multi-tenancy in the application. While this is a core feature that's built into ASP.NET Zero, what this basically means is that your application can be used for multiple tenants, so basically customers. ASP.NET Zero brings in data isolation, so that entities belonging to tenant A aren't visible to tenant B. Enabling this is pretty simple, since it's, like I said, built into the framework. To bring in support on the entity level, so in our case person, the type needs to implement the IMustHaveTenant interface. Based on this, ASP.NET Zero will then itself filter the entities belonging to the current tenant. In the final demo of this module, we are going to bring in support for multi-tenancy. In this final demo, I'm going to show you how you can enable multi-tenancy in the application. Multi-tenancy is built into AspNet Zero, so it's pretty simple to start using that. And basically what it will do, it will make sure that entities that belong to one tenant are isolated from other tenants. As mentioned, it's built in, so it's pretty simple to get this to work. Now we have in the very beginning disabled multi-tenancy. I hope you remember. In the phonebook demo consts class, we have set multi-tenancy disabled to false. Well, to enable it again, it's pretty simple. You enable it by setting this value to true. Now just doing that is not enough. You also need to go back to your entity, that is the person class. And instead of having this just be a full audited entity, we also need to implement an interface called the IMustHaveTenant interface. This interface has just a tenant ID property. So we're going to have to implement that property here as well. There we go. If you also directly would work with phones, we also need to implement it there. Now in this case, we only access phones via the person class, so it's not really necessary. But keep in mind that all entities that you directly use from your application should in fact now implement this interface and therefore have this tenant ID added. Now to enable this on the database level, we also need to do another migration. So we go back to the Package Manager console and add a new migration. Now in this migration, it only added basically this tenant ID column. Built into AspNet Zero, it now knows that this entity belongs to a certain tenant. Finally, we call update database, and this will apply that migration. Let's run the server-side application again and then see what has changed now that I have enabled multi-tenancy. Make sure, by the way, before you try this, that you log out, because otherwise you will not see the change. So I can now log in with my username and password again. I log in. And now you see here a new entry, tenants. By default, there's only one tenant available, and we can create a new tenant here. So now you can see that we have two tenants, the default, and then we have the test tenant. I can now actually jump to that tenant. I can log in as this tenant to basically see what a user of this tenant will see. I can select my admin user that I just created. And now we see our phonebook application again, but now we don't see any people, which is perfect because my users that we created earlier are not part of this tenant. We have effectively isolated the data from one tenant to the next. All right, we've made it. We have a working application. Now it's time to sit back, enjoy the feeling of success, and maybe have a good cup of coffee. Congratulations! We have one module left where I will close this tutorial and give you some pointers on where to go next. Now, the next step that we'll be doing is a very important one. We are going to create the application service. We've already discussed application services in the previous module. They will be exposing logic to the client, so the Angular application. In other words, it will contain the actual logic for an application invoked from the client. Communication from the client to the server and vice versa over the API will happen, of course, using JSON, and it's vital that we only transmit the data that's actually required. For that reason, we'll create a DTO, so a data transfer object that's specific to the operation at hand. Here in the snippet on the slide, you can see a class for the createPersonInput DTO, which will be used to capture the information when we create a new person instance. You'll see in the demo that the convention of ASP.NET Zero is that DTOs, as well as the application services, should be placed in the application shared project. In our application, we're going to create just an application service. See this as the entry point really on your server side. They shouldn't contain any complex logic. If you have complex domain logic and business rules, they should be actually placed inside the domain layer and domain services. To keep things simple here, we're not going to be adding any domain services in the demo. Through the application service, the presentation logic remains nicely separated from the real actual domain logic, making it possible to test your application domain in isolation properly. Application services in AspNet Zero are implemented as classes which implement an interface called iApplicationService. That's probably a good name for this interface, isn't it? In fact, you will typically don't implement this interface directly on your application service classes. Instead, you should create yourself an interface that describes the functionality of your application service. In this case, this will be iPersonAppService. In the interface declaration, we'll have a method called createPerson. Now you may be wondering, why do we need this interface really? Well, that's because of the fact that all services will be managed through dependency injection. It's important to note the naming. That's important here. ASP.NET Zero will register services and other types automatically based on convention. Dependency injection registrations with the container are done in a transient way. Alright, so now we are going to create an application service, and as mentioned in the slides, the application service is really the code that is going to be, let's say, invoked from the client, so in our case our Angular code, to basically perform operations on the application. Now, where are we going to place those application services? I hope you remember from the previous module that there are already quite a few application services built into AspNet Zero, and they are located in the application project. This is the project where we are going to create our own application service. Now, if we take a look at one of the built-in application services, for example, let's take organizations here again, then we see the organization unit app service, we see that this has an interface. Let's first create the interface. Now, the interfaces don't get created in the application project, they get created in the application shared project. So in here, I'll create a folder called Phonebook. And in there, I'll create my app service for persons. So I'll add a new class, iPerson app service. This of course needs to be an interface rather than a class. On this interface, I'll currently create one method. It's going to be a very simple method that is going to return all the people and all the person instances, that is. I'm going to, as you can see here, be using a couple of types that I haven't created just yet. Now, for all the communication between my client and my server, I'm going to use DTOs. DTOs are data transfer objects. They are pre-built classes that will be used to return the data that the client needs or that the client will be sending in the case that it's a parameter. The getPeopleInput is a DTO that will be used by the client to pass data via the request. The person list DTO is the opposite one. It will contain the data that is sent back from the server to the client. So we'll need to create those DTOs first. And they are also going to be placed inside of this application shared project. So in here, I'll create a new folder called DTO. And in there, I'll create my new classes. So I need to create the getPeopleInput, which will contain a filter, basically allowing the client to filter what type of persons we want to retrieve. I hope you remember from the demo application that you could also filter. Well, that's this value that we are going to be sending in. That's a request parameter for the server to know what the client wants. Let's make this class public, and I'll bring in a filter property. Next, you also need to create the person list DTO. Also a class that needs to be public, of course. Now, as you can see, what am I returning here? Well, I'm just returning the name, surname, and email address. Now, in this case, this is very similar to the person class, but imagine that we have a lot of extra properties on the person class, or we don't need to return all of these when we are just returning data for a list. That is why we limit the person list DTO to those fields used, well, in the list representation for the person instances. Let's go back here and bring in the correct using statements. There we go. It's still complaining about list result DTO. That's actually a built-in class of AspNet Zero. So let's bring that in as well. The list result DTO is a pre-built class that comes with AspNet Zero that makes it easier to return a list of other DTOs. That's all it is. Now, maybe you already know that when we are using DTOs and we use entities on the other end, we will have to do mapping. And we'll have to do mapping in quite a few places to go from the one type to the next. Now, of course, you can write that yourself, but it is a very tedious code to write. So instead, what we'll do is we'll use AutoMapper. And we saw already in the previous module that AspNet Zero uses AutoMapper quite often. Now, we'll first need to let my application know which mappings we'll need to have. Now, there's a class called the custom DTO mapper, which already contains a lot of mappings, and we'll add our own mappings to that class. The custom DTO mapper is located in the application project. Here you have it. In here, I can now add my own mappings. Now we'll need a mapping between the person class and the person list DTO. Well, that's a pretty simple mapping because the properties have the same names. So we don't need to add a lot of extra configuration here. We do need to bring in the correct types. I have added already a couple of other mappings for DTOs that we'll use later in this demo. Now, while we're in the application project, we can continue creating our actual application service. So let's also create here another folder called phonebook. And in there, I'm going to create my app service. I'm going to call it, of course, person app service. And this class, which is of course again a public class, will need to inherit from the phonebook demo app service base. That's a base class that comes with AspNet Zero. Secondly, I also need to bring in the interface that we just created, the iPerson app service. Now, Visual Studio is still complaining because you haven't implemented the method that we created on that interface. Let's do that next. Let's take a look at the code I've just pasted in here. First, my person app service is going to make use of the repository, the iRepository in person. That is going to be injected using constructor injection, as you see here. That is going to be also the helper to let us talk with the database. Then we have the implementation for the getPeople method. That is accepting, of course, the getPeople input and is returning the list result DTO of person list DTOs. Now, the iRepository is a generic repository that already contains quite a few implementations. For example, here I'm using the getAll method. Secondly, I use the .whereIf, and that's an extension method that actually comes with AspNet Zero. It will actually perform a filter if the passed-in value does not evaluate to null. Finally, we use the object mapper here to map the people into a list of person list DTOs. And that's going to be what we are returning. Now do make sure that if you still get errors at this point, you take a look at the using statements you see here on my screen, because they can actually cause some problems at this point. Now I can't run anything at this point just yet. We don't have the view that works with this app service just yet. So the only thing I can do at this point is do a build to make sure that we haven't made any mistakes. And that seems to be okay. I have a successful build. As we've talked about before, ASP.NET Zero has a strong testing infrastructure in place. In the next demo, we will build on this to create unit tests for our newly created application service. So in the previous demo, we couldn't run the application just yet. So we've written quite a lot of code, but we couldn't test it. So instead of already working on the UI, let me first show you how we can actually write a unit test for the code that we've just written, and then make sure that that already works. In order to make things a bit simpler, let's again make sure that the multi-tenancy enable property is set to false. All right, so let's write a unit test. Where are we going to put our unit tests? You know what? There's a test folder over here, and in there we have that test project that we, if you have been following along, have already looked at in the previous module. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to simply create another folder where I'm going to add the unit tests for my code. So I'm going to add the phonebook folder, and in there I'm going to write my unit test. So let's create a class. And I'm going to call that, since I'm going to be testing my person app service, the person app service tests class. Hit OK to add this new class. Of course, let's make this class public again, and we are going to inherit from the app test base class. The app test base is a class, again, that comes with ASP.NET Zero, and it does already a lot of work for us. It will do the initialization of the testing system. It will create an in-memory database. It will also seed the database with the seed data that we have created before, and so on and so on. So a lot of things are already in place so that we can focus on writing the actual test code. So what are we going to do? We are going to test, as mentioned, our person app service. So I'm going to bring that in. I'm going to be using the iPerson app service interface, add the reference, and then in the constructor, I'm going to resolve that iPerson app service. Using this resolve method that again comes with ASP.NET Zero, we are going to resolve the iPerson app service, and therefore we're going to get back a real person app service. And that's the one we want to test methods from. Now let's write our first real unit test. The first unit test that we are going to create is going to test that if we just ask the person app service to get all the people, that we are going to get back all the people. Let's try that. So this is the test that we are going to implement. Should get all people without any filter. So in other words, if we don't pass any filter, that's the get people input instance that we created earlier, then we should get back all person instances. We are using xunit. And that requires that we use the fact attribute on this test to make sure that this is recognized as a unit test. And there we go, we've now brought in the using statement. Typically, a unit test is written with the 3A principle, arrange, act, and assert. I don't really need to do any arranging here because I don't really need to set anything up, so that block is going to remain empty. Then we are going to do the act part. In here, I'm going to ask my person app service to get all people. So we're going to use the person app service, we're going to call the get people on it, and it requires, if you remember correctly, a get people input instance, passing in optionally the filter. But since we don't want any filter, we just pass it a new get people instance. There we go. And let's clean it up a little bit. There we go. Now, since this is using the real database and also the seeding, what should we be asserting? Well, we should actually assert that there are 2 people in the persons collection. So that the persons.items.count should be 2. And I'm going to use the shouldly assertion library that contains the should be method, which is going to assert that this value is actually 2. And of course, we should bring in the using statement for shouldly. We've now written our first unit test, and as you could see, that was a pretty simple thing to do. I'm going to bring in another unit test. And the second test is going to use a filter. I'm again going to fall back on the fact that the database is going to be handled by AspNet Zero for me, and that the data seeding is also going to take place. So I'm going to rely on the fact that getPeople will actually return me a user with the surname Adams. So I'm now calling getPeople with the getPeople input, passing in Adams as the filter, and then I do a couple of assertions. There should be exactly one result. The first name of that result should be Douglas, and the last name should be Adams. We've now written a couple of unit tests, and frankly, since they do a lot of integration, they're more integration tests. But anyway, let's try running these unit tests. So I'm going to go to my test explorer, and over here, I'm going to run my unit tests. I can actually now at this point run all the unit tests, or I can make a selection of my unit tests. And these are the ones that we have just added, the phone book unit tests. So I'm going to call here run selected tests. This is going to build my project and then execute my tests. And there we go, our tests have passed. So now we know that the logic that we created in the previous demo actually does work. Let's go back to the slides. With the application service tested, we're in a good place for the server side really. What we're now going to do is heading back to the client side and let our Angular code talk with the newly created application service. Our client-side code, however, will typically contain a lot of boilerplate code. Lots of lines of code are going to be about connecting with an endpoint on the API, downloading some JSON, and so on. I hope you remember from the last module that we looked at nswag, which will generate quite a lot of the typical boilerplate code for us. AspNet Zero has a bat file in the box that we can run, and that will look at the application services we have in the API. And based on that, it will generate code, in fact a proxy. That code we can then use from our own Angular code. Here you can already see some of the code that we'll be using in our component code. Notice that we are using the proxy, that is the generated code. Alright, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. First, we are going to generate the proxy class, and next we are going to create a first view in the Angular application to display data. So at this point, for now at least, we're pretty much ready with the server side. We can now focus again on the client side and actually invoke that app service that we just created from the client. So let's do that. I am going to start, and you should too by the way if you're following along, the API. There we go. That is now running again. So now we can actually go back to Visual Studio and start doing some coding from that side. So now we are again in Visual Studio Code. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to, of course, implement code in my component so that it actually talks with that person app service and will show the person instances, the people which are in my database. That's the ultimate goal at this point, right? So what are we going to do? Do we need to write all the code that talks with the app service? Well, typically you would have to do that. But as we've already shown before, we are using in ASP.NET Zero NSWAG, the open source library, and it will generate for us a lot of the boilerplate code that we typically have to write to do all the communication. In fact, most of the time we're just sending requests for GET, for POST, and that sort of thing. So typically all the code is very much the same. That's why we can generate it, or at least have NSWAG generated for us. So I'm going to open a new terminal window here. And from here, I'm going to invoke NSWAG again. So I'm going to go to my NSWAG directory. There we go. And from here, we are now going to call refresh.bat again. It actually went pretty fast again, but it should now have made a change to my proxy class. Let's take a look. So let's now go back to the shared folder under service proxies and then service proxies. And in there, code should now be generated. Now the generated class is going to talk with the person service. So in here, we should find the person service proxy. Let's take a look. And there we go. This is now the generated class that will perform the HTTP communication with my backend. It has also implemented the getPeople method that will talk with my API services app person getPeople. And it can also accept the filter here. So what this means is that all of this has been generated in a very clean way for us already. We don't have to do that ourselves. How cool is that? Now there is a new service class which has been added to this service proxies. We do need to let Angular know about it. And that I'm going to do in this service proxy module. Over here, I'm going to add an extra line here that specifies API service proxies dot person service proxy. That's the one. Don't forget the comma. Please note that if you just add an extra method on the backend service, then you don't have to do this step. This is only when you add a new service on the backend. A new service will get added in the proxy class, and therefore you also need to add it over here. It might actually be a good idea to stop the application from running and do an npm start again. I don't think it's always necessary, but it never hurts at this point because we have added this new proxy class. So let's do an npm start again. And the compilation went successfully. That's good. So now we're going to go back to our component and we're going to have it use my person service proxy. So I've now changed the code for my component a little bit. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to inject my newly generated person service proxy into this class. Notice that I've now added also that this class implements the onInit. That's a thing from Angular, and it requires me to implement the ng onInit. In there, I'm going to call the getPeople. And the getPeople method is a method that will use the person service to call the getPeople method, passing in the filter property. And the filter is defined as a string that will be filled in when we enter a value in the UI to search for a particular person. I'm then going to subscribe so that when the value is returned, I will update the people array in this class. And the people array, as you can see at the top, is an array of type personListDTO. That's the DTO we had on the server side, but it has also been generated because of my proxy. Now you also need to update the template still. Now the biggest change can be seen right over here. I'm going to loop over all the people using an ng-for, and this code is going to be repeated for each person instance within that people collection. For each of these, I'm going to use bindings to display the name, the surname, as well as the email address. If you've done everything correctly, we should now see the people appearing in our UI. So here's the running application. Let's click on Phonebook. And now we effectively see all the people, in fact, just these two, that we have currently in the database. So that seems to have worked. If you've been following along and you see the same result, congratulations. One more thing here. In this case, we're using plain HTML to generate this list of people. In a real-life application, you could easily bring in a third-party table component that gives you more options to display these people. Now that we have a list of people being shown already, let's in the next demo extend the functionality of the application. We're going to allow the user to add person instances to our list. That means that we'll first need to extend the API to support this scenario. Next, we'll then need to extend the Angular app, and we'll also add a modal dialog that allows the user to enter data for the person. So now you have seen basically the end-to-end scenario. We've written code on the server side, we've created the app service, we've then written a unit test, and then we have in Visual Studio Code used endswag to generate the proxy class, and we've then used that from the component. So that is the end-to-end flow, and you now have that one working. By means of a little bit of an exercise, let's say, I'm going to now do pretty much the same flow, but now we are going to add support to create a person. So we're going to do that together. I hope you follow along with me. So I'm going to start again in Visual Studio. And as mentioned, we are going to bring in support to create a new person. That's what we're going to do. So we're now going to go back to the source folder, of course. And we're going to go to the application shared project. In there, we have the interface iPerson app service. And in here, I'm going to define that I want to now give support for creating a person, right? So I'm going to bring in this task create person, which accepts, in this case, a create person input. That will again be a DTO, right? So let's bring in already support for the task library. There we go. And now we need to create that new DTO. Again, we're going to put that here in this folder. So I'm going to add new class, create person input, make that a public class, and bring in a couple of properties. Also bring in these data annotations. And we're going to fix these constants in just a minute. At this point, the create person input will receive a name, a surname, and an email address. Those are the fields we need to create a new person in our database. We'll also need to bring in another mapping to make sure that create person input will be mapped automatically using automapper to person. So we're going to go back to the custom DTO mapper class. And in there, I'm now going to uncomment the mapping between create person input and person. Now we still have an error here. The person const class is not known. That's correct. We haven't created that one. Now in here, instead of defining these lengths directly in this DTO class, I can actually do it in a better way. So I can reuse that. So I'm going to go to my core shared project. And in here, I'll create another folder called phone book to indicate that these things are related, of course. And in here, we're going to create a class which will be the person consts class. That will contain the values for the max length attributes. So if we go back here, we'll see that now we don't have any errors anymore because there's already a reference between these projects. If you would compile now, you'd see an error with the application service itself because of the fact that my person app service is not fully implementing our iPerson app service interface anymore. So what I now need to do is implement the createPerson method. The createPerson method will of course receive a createPerson input instance. That will be mapped into a person, and that will be passed along to my person repository that we used earlier to fetch the person instances from the database. I need to bring in support for the task library. There we go. And now everyone is happy again. So as you can see, this call is asynchronous. Indeed, we are using the insert async method to communicate with the database. Now we could directly go to the client and start talking with this createPerson method, but I suggest that we first a couple more unit tests. So let's go back to the test project. Person app service tests, and we'll add some more unit tests here. I've now added a first unit test that will validate that when we add a new person with valid data, that it effectively will end up in the database. How am I going to do that? Well, we are still using our person app service, and we're going to use the createPerson method, and we on the fly here create a new createPerson input. That should save my person into the database. That is the act part. In the assert part, I'm going to validate that this insertion went successfully. To do that in an easy way, I'm using again a method that comes with AspNet Zero called the usingDBContext. That will give me access to the context to see if that person, based on the email address, was effectively found in the database. So using shouldly, I test that that user is not null and that the name is effectively John. Let's run that unit test. I'm going to go back to my Test Explorer and run the selected test. And as you can see, our test has completed successfully. I'm going to add another test. I'm going to, in this case, pass a person which has invalid arguments. Remember that the createPerson input said that surname as well as name are required. So if I leave out, in this case, the surname, well then that person is not valid. And that's what I'm going to test here, that effectively my error flagging will take place. And that's effectively what I'm going to test here. I want to see that an exception will be raised. Now when I'm going to try to insert a person with just the name, an ABP validation exception will fire. And that's what I'm going to assert here. I want to verify that that exception effectively will be thrown. Let's run this test. And there we go. We now have 4 succeeding tests. So I think we're now in a good place. We already know that our code on the server side works. Let's run the API so that we can connect with it from the client. So there's the running API. Now we're good. We can now go to Visual Studio Code again. I hope you remember at this point I have changed my service so I can now have nswag regenerate the proxy code. I still have that open here in the second terminal tab. So let's call refresh bat again. And it should update my proxy code. There we go. That's all right. I'm going to add support, as mentioned, to add a person. I can do that in a separate window, but I think it's a better idea to do that in a dialog. Now, AspNet Zero comes by default with support for NGX Bootstrap, which is a library that allows you a lot of UI things, including modal windows. So we're going to add the functionality for adding this new person as a separate component. So here, in my phone book, I'm now going to add a new file. That file will be called createPersonModal component. There's quite a lot of code in here. I'm going to make sure that you understand what is going on here. First, notice that we are using the createPersonModal selector. I can now use this in my HTML. Again, we are extending the app component base. This will give me support for automatic translation, localization that is, and in this case, I will also use some other functionalities of this app component base, namely the notify. Next, notice that this component uses a modal save event. This one will be triggered when we effectively are saving the dialog. This allows me to, from my dialog, let the main page know about the fact that a new person was saved, so it can react to this and refresh its data. We are also using 2 view childs here. That allows me to access the modal and the name input elements inside my view. We are again using the person service proxy class. That's the same proxy class that will now have support to create a person. In the save method here, I'm using the person service create person. I'm passing in the this.person, and this.person was of type create person input. I then also want to be notified about the fact that the saving was successful. And then I will raise that modal save event, allowing my phone book component to be notified about the fact that everything was saved successfully. It can then react in turn with a reload of the data. We're also using another template here, which is the createPersonModal component HTML. Let's create that file now. You see here the most important part. I'm translating the labels, name, surname, and email address using the L function that we got via the app component base. And then we are using bindings to display the name, surname, and email address, as well as capture them, because it's a two-way binding. Now I need to make sure that Angular knows about my new component. So I need to associate it with a module. So again, we go to the main module. I will add support for our new component there. So now I've added to the declarations the createPersonModal component. And the import statement has been added automatically by Visual Studio Code. Now we've just added the modal dialog, but we cannot call it just yet. So we now need to go back to the list component where we are going to add a button that will open the modal. Here's a new code for this component. Notice I now have a button that will call the show method when clicked. Next, we also use the createPerson modal selector. That is basically adding the dialog inside of this window. It will be hidden by default. But when I click on my button, it will call code that will show this modal. When the modal save event is called from the createPerson modal component, getPeople will be called on the phonebook component, and that will allow me to refresh the list of persons. With all this in place, I think we should now be able to add a person successfully. Let's give it a shot. So let's go back to phonebook. There we have the ability to add a new person. And I'm now going to add myself. Click on save. And as you could see, the list has refreshed in the background and I have successfully added myself to the list of people, which is now also in the database. If I now close the application and rerun it again, I will still see myself in this list. Now that was a nice demo. Our application is starting to look a lot like a real application if you ask me. But we're not there yet. At this point, just any user working with our application can access the phonebook page. So indeed, we don't have any authorization just yet. That we will need to change, of course. So in the next part of the demo, we'll add authorization. Authorization in ASP.NET Zero works based on permissions that we have defined on the backend. So in the ASP.NET Core application. We'll need to define a permission in the app authorization provider first. And that's the code that you see here on the screen. The first parameter is actually the name of the permission. Permissions should have a unique name, and that's the second snippet that you see here. In ASP.NET Zero, we follow a convention to ensure that the names for these are unique. Of course, defining the permission is needed, but won't be doing an awful lot itself. We will need to apply it on the thing it needs to work with. Our permission will be used to secure the person app service, and so we will use the ABP authorized attribute, passing in the permission name, as defined before. The attribute can be used at the class level, as you can see here, but can also be applied on a method level, so we have the option to scope its reach. Now when we apply the permission on the backend, it will restrict access, so that users can't just access things anymore. And so, once the permission is defined on the backend, it will be required that we grant permission again, and this we can do using the role management. Now it may be a bit small to see here on the screenshot, but the newly created permission here is shown in the list. You'll see things more clearly in the demo in just a minute. Things are bright again, and the users belonging to that role can access the page again. Of course, we'll need to do some fine-tuning here. We shouldn't be able to navigate to the page if we don't have permissions on the page in the first place. And secondly, that menu item shouldn't even be showing. Well, that's correct. And that too, we can, based on the permissions the user has or doesn't have. This will be used in combination with the Angular router again, where we will now use a route guard. A guard is nothing more than some logic that's plugged into the router so that the router can decide if the requested navigation should happen or not. Secondly, we should also be hiding the menu item from the menu as well. Next to the menu item, permissions can also be used on another level, for example to show or hide a button. A good example would be the button to create a person that we created earlier. In this case, some logic is required that will be invoked based on an ngIf, so a check in Angular code. Alright, lots of things to do. Let's start by adding the permission in the application and using them from the client side. At this point, just anyone can work with our new component in the application. So anyone has access to the phonebook component. That we're going to have to change because in real-life applications also you're going to have to enable the role system to allow or disallow users to access or to work with certain pods. And for that, we are going to work with permissions. Permissions are actually defined on the server side in a class called the App Authorization Provider. There we are going to define the permissions, and then in the client side Angular application, in the running application that is, we can enable or disallow users to work with that certain component based on this permission. So as said, I'm going to define the permissions in a class called the App Authorization Provider. If you cannot locate this class, it's actually defined in the core project under authorization, and there you'll find this App Authorization Provider. In here, I will define my own permission. You can basically put them wherever you want, but I typically tend to place them under the tenant-specific permissions block. There you'll also find the dashboard, which is one of the already existing permissions that is used to hide or show the dashboard in the running application. So we'll add a line here to add our own permission. I've called the createChild permissions, and I'm passing a couple of parameters. The first parameter is the name of the permission. As you can see, I'm getting an error here. That's because I haven't defined this constant string here. I'll do that in just a second. Basically, the way that ASP.NET Zero works is a bit convention-based. We give a name, a constant string, to each of the permissions. So I'll go to the place where these are defined, and that's the App Permissions class, which is also in the same location, by the way. And over here, I'll add a constant string called pages tenant phonebook, which has as value pages.tenant.phonebook. It is a way to organize, let's say, the permissions, and you'll see that being reflected on the client-side application as well. So now everyone is happy here. As you can see, we're now not getting any exceptions anymore. So of course, defining the permission will not do an awful lot. We'll also have to use it, of course. And to do that, I'm going to work with an attribute, and it is called the ABP authorized attribute. Let us go to the person app service. So this is my person app service class. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify that only if the pages tenant phonebook permission has been granted, will you have access as a user to the functionality of this service. And I use for that the ABP authorized attribute. I need to bring in another using statement, and I also need to bring in a reference to my app permissions class. There we go. At this point, the class is basically protected from unauthorized users. That means that all functionality within this class is now basically unavailable for unauthorized users. Let's run the application and see the result of this. So here's the running application. I can click on phonebook and everything still works. Now you may be thinking, was that not the goal that we wouldn't see the phonebook anymore? Well, I'm actually logged in with the admin user, and by default, the admin user has access to all components. So we're going to change that. So we're going to go to administration, and then we go to roles, and we'll edit the admin role. Under permissions, we should now see phonebook. There we go. That's because I just added that permission. I'm going to disable this permission, hit save. And when I now click on phonebook again, now you see that I don't have the required permissions. For me to access this, it also mentions that I need the permission phonebook. All right, that seems to have worked. An additional problem is that basically I can still see and access the page. I only get the exception when I'm on the page. So we should actually optimize this a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Angular application, and in there I'm going to now add a guard. It's going to disallow access to the page if the permission is not granted. So it's going to also hook into that same permission system. That's really cool. So let's do that. I'm going to go to the main routing module, and in there I'm going to change the route. I'm going to add the guard. So as you now see, what I've done is for the phonebook path, which is handled by the phonebook component, I only will allow this if the permission pages tenant phonebook is available. If we now go back to the application, I'm not going to be able to click on phonebook anymore. Now, there's still one thing that bothers me at this point. I still see the phonebook entry in the menu. So we're going to change that as well. Now, in order to hide the entry in the main menu, I'm going to go to my app navigation service, which is located in the shared layout nav folder. In here, we had earlier already added the app menu item, but I'm going to change that. I'm going to change this null into the permission that I need to have. So replace this line. And if we now look again at the running application, so by default, I cannot see the phone book entry anymore, but I can re-enable it by going back to the administration roles, edit my admin role again, go to permissions, enable phone book, save, and do a refresh, and our phone book is again available and I can access it again as well. So now we have played with permissions on the page level, but we can actually go a bit deeper. For example, it would perhaps be possible that someone can see this page, but they cannot actually create a new person. So we are going to dive a bit deeper in the permission system. I'm going to go back to my .NET Core application. In the app authorization provider, I'm going to make a small change. See, the first line is actually the permission that we already had, but then onto that permission, I'm going to add another permission, a child permission, which is going to be working with the create person. Again, we of course need to create this constant here. So let's do that quickly. We follow the same convention. It is under phone book, the permission create person, and so we also use the same naming convention for the actual value. There we go. Now we go back to the app service, to the person app service that is, and now I'm going to place the ABP authorized attribute on the create person method. So basically this means that only if you have the create person permission on top of the phone book permission, will you be able to create a person. Now this is working, so let's run this. Now I need to polish this a little bit. I'm going to go to my phone book component HTML, and only if I have the permission, I'm going to show the button. That's of course a good thing to do. So this is the button that allows me to create a new person. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an ngIf that only is going to show this button if we have the create person permission. Let's see the result of this. So we go back to administration, roles, and we go back to the edit of the admin role. And now we indeed see the create new person permission. We can disable this one, hit save, go back to phone book, and it will still show. You need to do a refresh at this point. And there you go. Now the permission to add a new person is actually hidden from me. And so now you know how the permission system in AspNet Zero works. Let's go back to the slides. Person, but we can't delete a person just yet. You see that a lot of the things are similar here. So as an exercise, let's bring in support for deleting a person. So in this demo, we're now going to add support for deleting a person that we haven't done yet. And to change things a little bit, let us now start this time from the UI, since we are still here in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to go to my phone book component. Again, that's pretty normal. I'm going to add a button per row to delete the person. So let's take this code. I'm going to replace this so that we now have the deletion button. That's the button you see here at the bottom. As you can see, this button is going to call the delete person method. We don't have that yet. We'll need to add that in just a second. The title is going to be delete, but I'm actually going to add an icon to visualize this button. And before we go to the server side and write the code for the delete person, I am going to add a less file. A less file is a file used for styling, and we're going to create that first here under the phone book folder. So I'm going to add here the phone book component.less file, and we'll just leave it empty for now. Of course, we need to use this from the phone book component. Over here in the component declaration, we're going to add that we use that less file for styling. If you look at the application, we should actually already see the deletion button. There we go. There's our deletion buttons. Of course, they don't do anything just yet. We haven't hooked them up with deletion functionality. So let's do that next. So I'm back here in my person app service. So let's go to the interface iPerson app service and add the declaration for the deletion method. Task delete person, and we pass an entity DTO. That is the person we want to delete. By the way, the entity DTO is not an entity that we've added ourselves. It's a built-in entity. In this case, we typically only need the ID of the person that we are going to delete. And then we can actually use this, let's say, shortcut entity to add support for that. Let's go back to our person app service and implement our deletion method. So here I've added support for the delete person method. It is going to simply use the person repository to delete the user with the given ID that we passed via the entity DTO. Now, of course, not everyone should be able to delete. I'm going to have another permission, the delete person permission. Let's go back to our app authorization provider. And over here, we'll add another permission for deleting a person. And very similarly to what we have done before, we also should define the string for that. There we go. This should now work. Let's run this. With this running, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Now, if you think what we've done, we've added new functionality on the person app service. I hope you already remember what is the next step for you. Do you know what you need to do? I hope you thought of the fact that we need to run nswag again. Because we added new functionality, we need to bring that into the proxy again. So we'll go to the new terminal window again here, and we go to the nswag directory, and we call refresh.bat again. This now looks at my running service and should have added support for the delete person method in my proxy. Now, I also need to go back to my component and add support for deleting a person here as well. So I'm going to bring in the delete person method here. Now I get an error at this point, so let me first bring in another import statement from Lodash. This will add support for deleting it from the array. So what does this delete person method do? It's going to ask via a message to confirm that I really want to delete the person. And if the user says, okay, go ahead, and I'm going to use my person service to delete the actual person, and I'm going to subscribe to the successful deletion of the user on the server side. And then I'm also going to remove it from the local array. So, with that all done, let's take a look at the running application and delete a person. So here's my list. Well, let's remove this test entry here. I get the message to confirm I'm sure I want to delete. Hit OK, and there we go. We've now effectively deleted the person. One final aspect that I want to highlight here is the authentication part, which is typically a source for a lot of questions and even confusion for developers. We are working with the client and the server-side part of the application, and of course, all the real authentication happens on the server side. But of course, the server side is an API exposing endpoints, and those need to be secured against unallowed access. We can do this easily by enabling token-based authentication. In this approach, we need to authenticate the client against an open endpoint that will receive from the client the username and password. That communication needs to happen, of course, over HTTPS, since this information will go over the line in clear text. The server can then validate if the provided credentials are OK, and if so, it will generate a token for the Angular app to use with subsequent requests. This token is sent along with every request as part of the header. So far, the application is just using one single entity. In the next demo, which is quite a large one, we are going to bring in support for adding a child entity. Person instances can have phone numbers, and that's the relation we are going to bring in. Alright, so up until now, we've just used the person instances, but in the beginning, we created a phone book, and a phone book contains phone numbers. Our entities at this point do not contain phone numbers. So in this large demo, end-to-end, we are going to see how to add a child entity and also work with these from the interface. I'm going to start by extending my domain on the server side, that is, with the phone number support. So I'm going to add a new class phone. So we go to the core project, and there we find the person class. Next to that, we are going to add the phone class. Let's bring in support for the missing using statements. There we go. There's one missing at this point, which is phone type, and that's going to be an enumeration. That phone type enumeration, I typically add those inside of the core shared project. So over here under phone book, we already had the person const class. I'm going to add another new item, and it's going to be my phone type enumeration. Now let's bring in support for the phone type here. There we go. So this can now access that because core has a reference to core shared. Now our person class also needs access to the list of phones he or she will have. I'm going to add another property here called phones, which is an iCollection of phone. That's the place where I'm going to store the phones attached to that person. Now we also need to go to the DB context. I hope you remember where that is located. That's located in the Entity Framework Core project. Under Entity Framework Core, you will find the phonebook demo DB context. And over here, we'll add a DB set for phones, because of course that table needs to be generated in the database as well. Let's now actually generate the database. I'm going to go to my Package Manager console and add a migration. Make sure that this is set to the Entity Framework Core project, and then we'll add a migration called Added Phone. Hit OK, and this will trigger a compilation and also generate the migration for me. Here's the migration Added Phone. It looks okay. It has created a new table called PB Phones, and it also has the columns defined for that. Now, before we actually run a database update, I'm going to go back to my initial people creator class, and I'm going to add phone numbers in there as well. That was located in here under migrations seed initial people creator. And let's actually rename this class, because it's not going to only generate people anymore. It's also going to instantiate phones. I'm going to rename this class into initial people and phone creator. Hit apply. And this will now be updated everywhere. Hopefully, that is. By the way, let's also update the name here of the file. I'm going to now extend my create method so it does also generate phones. As you can see here, I'm now adding Douglas again, but to the phones property, I now add 2 phone numbers for him. And I do the same thing with Isaac here. We need to bring in support for the phone type enumeration. There we go. Hit OK. The next thing I now need to do is drop my database. Now you may be thinking, why is that? Why do you need to drop the database? Well, actually, this create method will only be called if I don't have the person table just yet. And the phone numbers are therefore not going to be inserted. So I'm going to go to my SQL Server Object Explorer here and delete my phonebook demo DB database. There we go. With all this done, we can now call update database. The database has been recreated and it also applied my new added phone migration. If we go back to the SQL Server Object Explorer and we navigate to our database, we should see under tables that we now also have the PB phones. There we go. Now, sadly, I can't show you anything just yet because we don't have support in our app service, in our DTOs for the phones just yet. So let's add that next. I'm going to go to the person app service. So now we're going to have to make changes to the person app service. Because of the DTOs, by the way, it only supports people. So the first DTO that I'm going to change is the person list DTO. Because that is returning name, surname, and email address, but I also need to have the phones, because otherwise I won't be able to display the collection of phones in the list. So I'm going to bring in a collection of, in this case, another DTO, phone in person list DTO. And I'm going to bring in a collection of those per person. I need to bring in that other DTO. For the sake of simplicity, let's add it to this particular file here. And let's bring in support for collection. Now, just as we've done with other DTOs, I also need to bring in support for the mapping again. So we need to go to our object mapper to support mapping from phone to phone in person list DTO. So that would be this line that we now add. Configuration create map and a mapping between thus phone and phone in person list DTO. Now let's go back to the person app service. And in there, we now need to bring in support for that extra list of phones per person. So what I've now changed here is that I'm going to bring in also the phones. I'm going to include them. That's a simple include statement that will also include the phones when the persons are being retrieved. So now at this point, we already have support to show the phones, but I'm also going to add support in my UI to add and delete phones. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to go back to my iPerson app service. And in here, we're going to add support for adding and deleting a phone. Now it's debatable whether or not these methods should be in the iPerson app service. They actually work on phones, so you could actually move them to a different service, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use my already existing service. And we also need this add phone input DTO. So let's go to this DTO folder and add a new class called add phone input. Let's bring in some more usings, and we also need to bring in support for this max number length. I have placed this in a separate class called phone consts before we used person consts. So we go back to the core shed and add a new class called phone consts. In here we make the max number length equal to 16. And over here, this already works now. And now let's go back to our app service. So in my person app service, we're now going to have to work with phones. I'm going to again use the built-in base repository. So I'm going to now bring in a repository for phones. I then of course need to update my constructor to also bring in an instance of this repository via constructor injection. And we of course set the phone repository equal to the one that's brought in. There we go. With this in place, we can now implement the new methods on the interface. So I've added now support for deleting a phone, which is simply going to use the phone repository and delete based on the ID, the phone number. Adding a phone is first going to get the person from the person repository. Then we're going to add to the phones collection on the person that new phone. And then we can save that back to the database. Now we will also need another mapping that will support mapping the phone back into the phone in person list DTO. So that is going to require me to add another mapping in my custom DTO mapper. That's this one. Now you still see an error here, and that's on permission. I have an edit person permission that I don't have in my app permissions class. That is the edit person permission. And of course we'll need to add the string constant as well. And at this point, everyone seems happy. I think we can run the API already again. So my API is running. Let's now return back to the client side. We've made some changes to the person app service. So the first thing we'll need to do is again run refresh bat on nswag. Now I'm going to have to make some changes to the code so that we actually have support for managing the phone numbers on each of our person instances. So we're going to go back to the phonebook component HTML. I've made quite some changes here. Let me show you what I've changed here. On each of the persons in the list, I've added a button allowing me to edit that person. That will show this table of phones, and I'm going to loop over the phones in the person that we selected. If we can edit the person, we'll be able to delete the phone. So that means that only if we have the edit person permission, we'll be able to manage the phones for that person. The component also requires some changes. We already had support to delete a person, but now I also have added the ability to edit a person. The edit person method allows me to, well, change a person into editing mode, and you'll see that in the application in just a second. We also have the ability to change the type of phone number that we are editing. We can also delete a phone for a person and save a phone for a person. All of this is relying on the proxy code generated again via nswag. I think now is a good time to run the application and see the result of this. So here we are again in phonebook. We can now edit a person, and this will effectively show me the list of phone numbers attached to that person. I can also delete them and add a new phone number based on the phone type I select here. Let's try that out. Let's, for example, add a new mobile phone number. Hit save over here, and now that phone number is added. I can also delete that again. I've clicked the edit button again, and basically I've now removed the person from edit mode. Now we can already work with the phone numbers, but I also still want to add an edit mode for a person. So that's what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to go back to my app service, and I'm going to add two more methods here. Here I'm going to get a person to edit that person, and finally I'm going to update that person in this edit person method. Of course, I've also updated my interface to add support for these functionalities. Now you see that we're still missing the DTOs. Let's add those. So we go back to the DTO folder here, add a new class. That will be the edit person input. Next, I'll bring in the get person for edit output and get person for edit input. And for the sake of simplicity, I'll put those in this file as well. There we go. At this point, the app service is also happy. All the required types are now found. Now let's go back to the custom DTO mapper and add these custom mappings. Now, in fact, I should say to you at this point, we don't really need those because they would actually work out of the box. But just for the sake of completeness, let's add these mappings as well. Let's run at this point the API again. Now, because we made changes in the server side, let's go back to nswag and let it run again. Now, to allow support for editing a person, I'm going to add another HTML file here. I've called it the edit person modal component. As the name implies, this will be another modal pop-up that allows me to edit the person properties. This is a pretty simple piece of HTML that is just going to visualize the person name, surname, and email address. You of course need to call this from the phone book component. I'm going to add another button here. There we go. That allows me to edit the person, so the phone numbers, and also edit the person via the modal window. And just like we did with the create person modal, I'm going to also bring in my edit person modal dialog here. Of course, at this point, this will not be found, so we need to bring in another component for that modal dialog. That's going to be the edit person modal component. This has a selector edit person modal so that Angular knows that this edit person modal should be handled via this component here. The code for this is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend any time on it. You of course need to now also let Angular know about this modal component. So we need to go back to the main module, where we earlier added support for the phone book component as well as the create person modal component. And now we need to bring in the edit person modal component. And add another import here as well. With this in place, we should now be able to run the application again and edit persons as well. And now I can click here on edit person. And now the dialog is effectively showing, allowing me to edit my person. With this in place, we now have a fully working application. How cool is that? So far, we haven't looked at the multi-tenancy in the application. While this is a core feature that's built into ASP.NET Zero, what this basically means is that your application can be used for multiple tenants, so basically customers. ASP.NET Zero brings in data isolation, so that entities belonging to tenant A aren't visible to tenant B. Enabling this is pretty simple, since it's, like I said, built into the framework. To bring in support on the entity level, so in our case person, the type needs to implement the IMustHaveTenant interface. Based on this, ASP.NET Zero will then itself filter the entities belonging to the current tenant. In the final demo of this module, we are going to bring in support for multi-tenancy. In this final demo, I'm going to show you how you can enable multi-tenancy in the application. Multi-tenancy is built into AspNet Zero, so it's pretty simple to start using that. And basically what it will do, it will make sure that entities that belong to one tenant are isolated from other tenants. As mentioned, it's built in, so it's pretty simple to get this to work. Now we have in the very beginning disabled multi-tenancy. I hope you remember. In the phonebook demo consts class, we have set multi-tenancy disabled to false. Well, to enable it again, it's pretty simple. You enable it by setting this value to true. Now just doing that is not enough. You also need to go back to your entity, that is the person class. And instead of having this just be a full audited entity, we also need to implement an interface called the IMustHaveTenant interface. This interface has just a tenant ID property. So we're going to have to implement that property here as well. There we go. If you also directly would work with phones, we also need to implement it there. Now in this case, we only access phones via the person class, so it's not really necessary. But keep in mind that all entities that you directly use from your application should in fact now implement this interface and therefore have this tenant ID added. Now to enable this on the database level, we also need to do another migration. So we go back to the Package Manager console and add a new migration. Now in this migration, it only added basically this tenant ID column. Built into AspNet Zero, it now knows that this entity belongs to a certain tenant. Finally, we call update database, and this will apply that migration. Let's run the server-side application again and then see what has changed now that I have enabled multi-tenancy. Make sure, by the way, before you try this, that you log out, because otherwise you will not see the change. So I can now log in with my username and password again. I log in. And now you see here a new entry, tenants. By default, there's only one tenant available, and we can create a new tenant here. So now you can see that we have two tenants, the default, and then we have the test tenant. I can now actually jump to that tenant. I can log in as this tenant to basically see what a user of this tenant will see. I can select my admin user that I just created. And now we see our phonebook application again, but now we don't see any people, which is perfect because my users that we created earlier are not part of this tenant. We have effectively isolated the data from one tenant to the next. All right, we've made it. We have a working application. Now it's time to sit back, enjoy the feeling of success, and maybe have a good cup of coffee. Congratulations! We have one module left where I will close this tutorial and give you some pointers on where to go next. Hi there, and welcome to the last module of this tutorial on ASP.NET Zero. I'm Jill Clearer, and thanks for sticking around until the very end. In this last module, we are going to summarize the course and give you some pointers on next steps after completing this tutorial. So we'll start with a brief summary. Then I'll give you some things you can do after completing this tutorial. And finally, I'll present you with a list of links to explore ASP.NET Zero in more detail. I hope that by now you have a clear understanding of the ASP.NET Zero product. I hope it's clear that ASP.NET Zero definitely targets you as a developer. It's not a drag and drop product for building applications that limits you as a developer. Far from it. It requires technical knowledge of the frameworks that it uses as well as patterns and practices. As said, it targets the developer who wants to build an application based on a solid foundation with proven technologies, frameworks, and best practices. In our case, the application we have built relies on ASP.NET Core and Angular. It's flexible. You have in fact a starter solution that you build upon that doesn't constrain you. It helps you in making decisions. It has a solid architecture ready, and it basically means that you won't be reinventing the wheel every time you start a new project. We looked at the ASP.NET Core and Angular version in this tutorial. However, multiple versions exist, allowing you to build different versions of the application targeting different types of platforms. As we have already discussed, ASP.NET Zero